Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. Without any further interruptions, enjoy the What If. Chapter 26. One flew over the Kurisaki's mind to do what's necessary. You're in Karakura's psychiatric institution for mentally ill. You've been here for the past 8 years, ever since your mother died in an accident and you went crazy. Ichigo's eyes snapped open and his unfocused sight fell on the cold, stony wall, about 15 centimeters before his face. For a full minute, he just stared at it, his dizzy and slightly disoriented mind unable to form a coherent thought. The muscles around his left eye twitched and he shifted his sight. Yet again, the only thing he saw was the unfriendly concrete wall. A quiet groan escaped his lips. Erg. As soon as his voice came out of his mouth, a sharp pain throbbed within his skull and caused him to grimace. Closing his eyes, he took several deep breaths and tried to relax his body and his mind. Slowly, trying to keep his head still, he raised his left hand and placed its palm on his forehead. What happened? His inner voice barely finished saying that before vivid images rapidly flashed within his mind. Images of him fighting a certain man with brown hair and a god complex. Images of a certain battlefield. A certain brown-skinned goddess. His friends. And then his cruel wake-up call. He withdrew the hand from his face and placed it on his torso. For a moment, he just breathed. In, out, in and out. A patient in a psychiatric institution, huh? He asked himself out loud in a disbelieving tone. Then he shifted his sight to glance at his right and then at his left hand. Well, at least I'm not wearing a straitjacket anymore. Once he said that, he found himself unable to resist an urge to snort. Then he grimaced. He forgot about the throbbing pain in his head. Must be from whatever that guy used to knock me out. He closed his eyes again. All right, Ichigo, you've been through a lot of crap, so this is nothing in comparison. You are not stupid, so use that damn brain of yours and figure this out. He thought to himself as he released a calming breath. I clearly remember everything that has happened so far. It is impossible for all of that to be just a fake memory or a grand delusion of my apparent craziness. I remember Rukia, Renji, Byakuya, Yoruichi, Urahara-san, Dad, Arankars, Shinigami and Quincy so clearly. Yes, they are not just a product of my imagination. They do exist. This is just another attempt to shake my resolve. For a brief moment, he opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling above him. Though I have to admit, whoever did this made an incredible effort. To create an illusion of such a twisted reality, an illusion, wait. He blinked when a disturbing thought entered his mind. Is it possible? He muttered quietly. Narrowing his eyes, he held his breath and entered the deepest parts of his mind. Aizen, could this be his doing? I remember killing him, but he did try to release his bankai before that. Is this the result? He certainly is capable of faking his own death in order to manipulate me into thinking I won only to activate some crap. But for this to be an ability of his bankai, it feels so real. The words echoed within his mind as droplets of a heavy rain, continuously falling onto the tin roof of his consciousness, and, in that moment, Ichigo realized one thing. It was quiet, not just in the room. It was quiet in his mind too. Too quiet. Zangetsu. He waited for a few seconds, then called for his Zanpakuto spirit once more. This time, his inner voice turned a bit louder. Zangetsu. He yelled several times but there was no response. There was no voice to answer him, to relieve his anxiety and all his worries, all of it with a simple greeting. The only answer he received was an endless and eternal silence. The teen gulped and a cold feeling ran across his spine, causing goosebumps to appear all over his body. Ever since the fateful day when he met a certain old man within his inner world, Ichigo had never once encountered a complete silence of his mind. Now, after all those months, such a thing felt surreal, eerie and even terrifying. It was a one-of-a-kind silence. A quietness that scared him more than he dared to admit. Feeling a rather panicky, he reached into his mindscape and tried to get a hold of his spiritual energy. Quote. His left hand, with which he was physically reaching into the air above him, froze. I feel nothing. The hand, frozen in midair, fell on his torso and a sudden revelation hit him with full force. I'm completely alone. As soon as he said it out loud, almost all of the energy disappeared from his body, for a long moment leaving just an empty shell of a human being behind. Briefly, the flame of the teen's resolve flickered like a candle in a cold breeze. Then his fingers twitched. Something within his soul tugged at him, causing him to clench both his hands and to form a pair of fists. So, this is your plan, huh, Aizen? Isolating me from everything, making me feel alone and scared, he stated loudly. Then he blanched and his brow creased into a confused frown. Forget Aizen's plan. More importantly, how do I get out of this illusion in the first place? Before he could muse any further, the door to his room screeched open and the same man that had knocked him out hours ago walked inside, wearing a wide grin on his oblong face. Finally awake, Kurosaki. Good. Now, do you think you'll behave or do you need your straitjacket again? A frown, still present on Ichigo's face, deepened. Something about the man's appearance bothered him, made him feel nervous. And it wasn't because he looked just like the man that had once attempted to kill him. I don't need it, he replied after a moment, causing the man's grin to widen, if that was even possible. Good, good, that means we can go for our regular little stroll. Ichigo raised one eyebrow but said nothing in return. He shifted on the bed and tried to stand up only for the man to place a hand on his shoulder. Nah, you always seem to forget this, but the stuff I use to knock you out is fairly strong. If you stood up right now, you'd puke your guts out. Here, he said while shaking his head. Then he reached behind him and dragged an ordinary wheelchair to the teen. As he was being helped into it, Ichigo couldn't help but to grunt. Then you shouldn't have knocked me out with that in the first place. Well, normally, we use different stuff to do so. But it has proved ineffective against you and so we're forced to use sedatives for horses when dealing with you. At least this proves what I've been saying for years now. When his rump hit the sitting part of the wheelchair, resulting in another attack of a throbbing pain, Ichigo scoffed. Yeah, what's that? The man made sure the teen was properly seated before answering. That you're an animal. Ichigo forced the urge to punch him. The expression on the male nurse's face was really irritating. Only through a series of deep breaths he managed to calm down. I can't afford to get knocked out like the last time. I need my mind to be clear so I can think of a way to escape this illusion. He mentally reminded himself. Then the man pushed the wheelchair, slowly maneuvering it out of the room and allowed the teen to see the gloomy hall with low ceiling and stony walls that desperately needed fine repainting for the first time. For a moment, his wheelchair stopped and he sensed the man closing the door of his room. During those few seconds, Ichigo heard an almost inaudible muttering coming through the door of the room situated right next to his and narrowed his eyes. LLM. Quote. He raised one eyebrow and, curious, leaned to a small slot in the door. Bang! Something hit the door from within with such force, the hinges shook and Ichigo himself almost instinctively jolted out of the wheelchair. What the hell? Ah, crap, you woke up the beast. The male nurse groaned and quickly reached into his pocket for a small radio transmitter. Yeah, I need a tranquilizer for the room 51. Yeah, again, yeah. Ichigo tuned the man out and, instead, focused his attention on the door that slightly shook again. Carefully, he leaned to it once more. This time, he heard a more distinct whispering. Kill them all, survive to the end, kill them all. His throat went dry and forced him to moisten it with a gulp. He felt an unpleasant chill at the back of his neck and a pressure at its front, what reminded him of the first time he had met Kenpachi. Unable to recognize the animalistic voice, which sounded like it was coming from behind a thick curtain, he cowered from the door. Ah, sorry about that. I hope you didn't get scared. The male nurse mocked him from behind as he tucked the radio transmitter back to his clothes. Ichigo ignored the jib, as well as the bead of sweat on his own forehead, and glanced at the man. Who is in there? The man chuckled and pushed his wheelchair again. You wouldn't believe me even if I told you. Ichigo was not satisfied with such an answer, but no matter how many times he asked, the man refused to give him a proper explanation. He just formed that unsettling and huge grin of his and cheerily pushed the teen forward. Passing the long corridor full of doors, they entered a large hall full of people. Since you had another episode, I guess I should say, welcome to the cafeteria. So, hungry? The male nurse asked as they continued forward. Ichigo, momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden amount of light, people and noise, just shook his head. You sure? Community group meeting begins in 15 minutes, so we still have some time. Ichigo, overhearing his words, shook his head again. No, let's just keep strolling. I want to see more of this place. So I can figure out what exactly is going on and how can I get out of here. He added mentally. Fine, your call. From that point onwards, the male nurse remained silent, save for occasional exchange of words with other nurses they passed by. Ichigo was thankful for that. It gave him more than enough time to observe his surroundings and to study the layout of the institution. However, after a short while, he began to regret that. His breathing got heavy and his anxiety levels increased drastically. The first time it happened was when they strolled across a large room filled with other patients. Most of them looked bland and Ichigo didn't recognize them, but when they strolled past a small table with a radio on it, Ichigo froze. It wasn't the song that caused him to freeze, though. The reason was a couple of tired-looking patients sitting next to it. They appeared to be bickering animatedly. I am the king of the Hueco Mundo. Screw you. I am the king of Hueco Mundo. A lowly cat like you should kneel before me. Who are you calling a cat, you skeleton? They were so focused on their squabble, they completely missed Ichigo's completely floored expression as the male nurse skillfully guided him around them. The second time it happened was after they left the large room and entered yet another corridor. They crashed into a man that seemingly materialized right in front of them. Ga, oi, ura, do you want me to run you over? The male nurse exclaimed as soon as he managed to get the wheelchair with Ichigo in it under control. The man they crashed into quickly got from the ground and bowed a little while taking his hat off. Ah, sorry about that. I must have drifted into my own space. The man with messy light blonde hair and a chin stubble said hurriedly. Before Ichigo blinked, he pushed something into the male nurse's pocket, causing the man to sigh. Fine, now go. This one is on his way to the community group meeting. On it, sir. Still in shock from the man's appearance, Ichigo felt the man's hand on his forearm. In the next moment, he saw him wink. You Urahara-san, no, I mean it. My legs are just fine, so there is no need for this wheelchair. Ichigo muttered indignantly while giving a nurse an intense stink eye. The woman just laughed and lightly patted the teen's head. I'm sorry, sweetie, but you'll have to trust us. This is for your own good. Ichigo kept his foul stare for a moment longer but then sighed resignedly. Over the course of the past few days he had come to understand that each nurse in the institute was more stubborn than even he was himself. He had hoped the nurse that had picked him up this morning, a woman that looked exactly as Rangaku Matsumoto, would be different. To his disgruntlement, despite her motherly personality, she was twice as stubborn as the others. And Ichigo didn't really want to spend his energy on pointless bickering anymore. Not to mention that he was feeling really weak all the time. No, he had more pressing stuff to think about. Still, his thoughts had been getting slightly misdirected these days as an image of a certain man, a certain genius shopkeeper, kept popping within his mind more and more often. Ever since he had met Urahara Kazuki on his stroll 5 days ago, he had been unable not to think about him, and with each day, more questions popped into his mind. But, aside from the rest, one question remained to be the most important of them all. Was Urahara a part of the illusion, or did he manage to penetrate it and came to get the teen out of it? Letting the nurse push him forward through the cafeteria, Ichigo subconsciously formed a grimace. With his fingers, he impatiently tapped the wheelchair's armrests and blew a bit of air through his nostrils. The question had started innocently, yet it was now slowly starting to eat him away, to nag his brain, to occupy his thoughts and to rob him of his precious energy. But as usual, he's nowhere to be found. He thought bitterly and silently accepted a toast from the nurse. Though he wasn't really hungry, the mindless chewing actually helped him to increase his concentration. However, this time, he regretted it. His sharpened focus only further annoyed him as he scanned the area, looking for the scientist once again. Damn you, Urahara-san. First you give me hope and now you're hiding from me. I have to know the truth. Gnawing at the rest of the toast, the teen almost bit his own fingers but managed to stop himself in time. He scowled. Truly, was the man making fun of him? Was hiding from him his idea of a prank? Because if it was, he wasn't interested in it. And it also certainly wasn't funny. A quiet growl seeped through Ichigo's tightly shut lips and the teen gripped the armrests, feeling especially irritated. Damn it, he thought angrily. Truthfully, he wanted to yell it out loud. Seeing as he was already considered to be a crazy person, doing so surely wouldn't have been nothing unusual. Yet he didn't do it. There wasn't really a point in doing so. Acting crazy just for the sake of appearing crazy in an illusion created by a mind of another crazy person just seemed so silly. Nonsensical even. Ichigo-chan, here. When he heard the voice calling out to him, Ichigo raised his head and a tiny smile formed on his lips. He moved on the wheelchair so he could look at the owner of the voice better. A flamboyant male patient was energetically waving at him and the sight momentarily erased the teen's worries. He liked the man. Raising his hand, he waved him back but negatively shook his head. Sorry, but I'll have to postpone our game of chess for one more day. He exclaimed and almost chuckled when the man pouted like a child. Nevertheless, the man was in the middle of a card game with another patient, so his pouting lasted only for a second. Okay, see you, Ichigo-chan. Ichigo smiled at him but then nodded to the nurse. Once she pushed him forward, the teen allowed himself to lose the smile and to sigh in sadness. He really liked Shunsui and seeing him like that, reverted back to a childlike persona, hurt a lot. However, he wasn't allowed to remain sad for long as the doors to the cafeteria burst open and a one-armed woman barged inside while holding a light-up firework that immediately began to shoot sparks in every direction. The queen of fireworks is here, bitches. Make way. The dynamic entrance coupled with a voice filled with pure joy caused Ichigo to chuckle quietly. The woman soon created a complete mayhem and the teen shook his head in amusement. Another day, another attempt. She's like a rocket with a never-ending supply of fuel. For a while, he just sat there and enjoyed himself. The image of nurses panicking and trying to catch the fire starter was incredibly gratifying and he watched the scene with a barely hidden grin. However, the same thing was happening on regular basis and so nurses got everything under control very soon. Using the bit of time before his own nurse returned to him, Ichigo put his hands on the wheels and pushed himself in a direction of a long corridor that was seemingly filled with an air of desperation. It took him only a minute to reach a certain room that he had found the day before. Inside the room, there was a small, petite woman sitting on a bed with her legs tightly secured under her chin and her arms wrapped around them. Her eyes were empty but when she caught a sight of the teen, a tiny spark appeared in them. Kurosaki-san, did you come to tell me more? She asked in a fragile tone. Ichigo gulped and forced back the tears. Yes, Rukia, he said and maneuvered further into the room, stopping only once he was directly in front of the woman. After that, he opened his mouth and began talking. It appeared that even in the illusion, Rukia Kuchiki had the same name. However, that was the only thing that was the same. Her personality was a complete opposite of what Ichigo remembered. The Rukia in the institution was a patient with suicidal tendencies, a person who believed that death was the salvation needed for a happy life. A person who, at the first mention of Soul Society, a place that served as an afterlife, smiled for the first time in 10 years. At least that was what the nurse had told him. Because of that, Ichigo had sworn to regularly visit Rukia so he could tell her everything he knew about Soul Society if only to see her smile again. He knew that he was caught in an elaborate illusion but the sheer pain in the eyes of Rukia's copy had broken all of his barriers and had reminded him of the first time they had met and how, during that night, she had saved him and his world. Once he had remembered that, he couldn't have just done nothing. He had hoped that by telling her about Soul Society, he could cheer her up, help her from the depression. So here he was again, talking about what he knew from his memories. But what happened once he finished his monologue and just moments before the nurse came to take him away, caught him unprepared. Turning to him, Rukia gave him a tender smile and then turned away to look out the window. Killing myself really looks like the best way to get to the Soul Society, don't you think? Blinking rapidly, Ichigo took a double take. He opened his mouth but no voice seemed to come out. He just sat there in complete shock. That was how the motherly nurse found him a minute later when she came to take him away. A good portion of the day then flowed past him like a breeze, just barely tickling his senses and leaving him disturbed and deep in thoughts for most of it. He finally raised his head and offered his full attention only when the nurse leaned deeply into him and whispered to him something that made him gulp. "Your family is here to see you, sweetie." Feeling dread in his guts, Ichigo let himself get steered into the meeting room, where the nurse left him at a small table. As soon as she left, he began to take deep breaths to collect his emotions as much as he could. Somehow, he knew that meeting his illusionary sisters and father was not going to be easy. After a few minutes, the door on the opposite side of the room slowly opened, allowing for a pair of shy faces to peek inside. Ichi ni, he silently, yet furiously fought back the tears that threatened to form in the corners of his eyes. Carefully, as not to scare the girls off, he put both his hands below the table and then clenched them hard. Hey, with great effort, he managed to form at least a tiny smile. His voice came out a little bit croaked, but it didn't look like anybody noticed it, as both girls ran across the room as soon as he looked at them. He half expected them to jump at him and envelop him in a tight hug, but he stood corrected when he watched them nervously sit on the chairs opposite of him. Despite being a poor reader of subtle emotions and body language in general, he realized his mistake rather quickly. "They are afraid of me," he thought bitterly. "Ichigo." He raised his head to see his father walking through the door and, for a moment, he froze. What happened to him? He looks so old. "How are you doing, son?" Isshin asked while giving the teen an intense stare. Struggling to form an answer, it took Ichigo a moment to recover. "Fine. I'm fine. Better. I mean." Isshin's beard, half gray and half black, moved a little as the man formed a tired but an honest smile. "I see. That's good to know." Ichigo watched him sit down and join Yuzu and Karen with a barely hidden sad frown. Is something wrong, Ichi-ni?" Yuzu hesitantly asked as soon as she noticed a change in his demeanor. Cursing silently, Ichigo shook his head and gave her an eye smile. "Nah, I'm just happy to see you." His answer managed to create a tiny spark of hope in his little sister's eyes, causing Ichigo to clench his fists even more. To change the flow of his thoughts, he glanced at Isshin. "So, anything interesting happened lately?" Actually, yes. You recall Ruken Ishida, the director of Karakura Hospital, a white-haired man with glasses and a bit cold appearance. Yeah, sure." Isshin made a weird sound, which Ichigo translated as a chuckle. "The stubborn arrow offered me a good position in the hospital and I was thinking of accepting it." Ichigo smiled. "Really? That's great, right?" Slowly, but surely, the conversation picked up and allowed the teen to hear much new information. Most of it was useless to him, however, he still listened to everything. It felt nice to just turn off his brain for a moment, to let go of everything that had been bothering him for the past few days and ever since he had woken up in the institution. Illusion or not, his father was still his father, and the two of them easily chatted, albeit with a bit of teasing and insulting. Just as Ichigo remembered it. However, the nice scene was bound to end soon enough, and it came sooner than expected. It happened right after Yuzu and Karen, too happy with the way things were going, jumped out of their chairs, flanked the teen and jumped at him to squeeze the life out of him in a tight and a warm hug. In that moment, all the emotions Ichigo had been carefully trying to suppress came crashing down on him. "Hey, Dad." "Yeah?" Isshin asked and nervously glanced at his daughters, ready to grab them at the first sign of danger. "When can I go home?" The second he uttered the last word, Ichigo felt his sisters and his father tense. Confused, he frowned at the man. Did I say something bad?" Visibly nervous, Isshin quickly shook his head. "And no, of course not, son. Well, it's been nice talking to you again after such a long time, but we need to go. Yuzu and Karen need to finish their homework and I need to make some calls." What's going on?" Ichigo asked, unintentionally raising his voice and causing the door behind him to open. When he glanced back, he saw a group of nurses walking towards him. Looking back at Isshin, who managed to snag both his daughters from him, Ichigo stood up. "Hey, what is this? I just asked when I can go home. Why are you making such a fuss?" he exclaimed, actually starting to feel anxious at that point. Blood rushed to his head and a bead of sweat appeared on his brow. Coming from behind him, he heard one of the nurses mutter. "Great, he's relapsing again, hold him down." Alarms went off in his head. What? No, I'm not relapsing. I was just asking a simple question. Somebody sighed. Yeah, that's always the trigger. Several hands grabbed his body and, despite his best protests, forced him to sit down. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a large syringe filled with a familiar liquid. No, he whispered and glanced back to Ishin. The man was keeping his daughters behind him while also slowly backing away from him. Wait, Dad, no. Don't do this, please. I take the question back. Just don't let them do this to me. He pleaded loudly, but his voice fell on deaf ears. Seeing that, something within the teen broke and an incredible anger filled his mind. Get off of me, he yelled and swung back his right fist. His knuckles came into contact with something soft and squishy and somebody cried in pain. Now, do it now. Desperately, he tried to move away, but a sharp metal pierced the skin of his left shoulder. A dull pain later, he felt something being forcibly pumped into his bloodstream. No, don't do this, please, please, please. But soon, his tongue began to feel heavy and clumsy, making talking practically impossible. His vision started to fade away, to get cloudy, and not even blinking seemed to help. He swallowed nothing but air one more time before his consciousness finally left his body. Only the illumination from the moonlight managed to penetrate the darkness of the night, when Ichigo lurked in the shadows and patiently waited for the night shift nurse to finish making his round. The glow of the flashlight danced across the hall and jumped from one door to another slowly. The nurse took his time to study the locks on each door. With a heavy heart, the teen, hidden behind a large plant, watched as the man quietly hummed and then, a minute later, left the area. It was Ichigo's fifth attempt to escape the facility. So far, he hadn't succeeded even once. However, he still considered himself very lucky because during each attempt, he had managed to slip past everyone unnoticed, failing only once he reached the final doors that separated the inside of the building and the outside world. And there were 15 doors like that in the institute. 15 exits. 15 chances for a normal life. Time to find out whether the sixth one is the same as the previous 5 were. An impasse, he thought sourly. Ever since the meeting with his family, the teen had grown incredibly suspicious. Why was it that they were all trying to prevent him from getting out? Was getting out the method of breaking the illusion? When the sound of the nurse's footsteps completely died down, he leapt into action. Running across the hall, his bare feet barely made a sound. It didn't take long before he reached the exit doors he had marked as his next target. Tentatively, he reached for the door handle and pressed it. Damn it, he cursed quietly. The doors were locked. Raising his head, he glanced around himself and outside the window, to see where the moon was. Should I risk going for another door? I still should have a few minutes left before they make another round, he debated with himself. Something rustled behind him and he instantly turned around. There was nothing but the darkness. Quietly letting out air through his mouth, the teen tried to relax his increased heart rate. With his left hand, he wiped the bit of sweat that formed on his forehead and shook his head. I should go back. I can't get myself knocked out again. The last time I did, I was out for one day and then couldn't think properly for another. Disappointed with the result of his little crusade, he let go of the door handle and began walking in the opposite direction, his shoulders sagged and his whole posture screaming frustration. Silently, but cautiously, he backtracked his own steps until he stood in front of the hallway where his room was. He took a deep breath and raised his leg to take a step forward, but, randomly glancing to the left, he saw a bit of moonlight glowing through a window and immediately stopped moving. There was another hallway on his left and the faint white glow revealed a door of a certain room. A certain room he had discovered by accident during one of his previous attempts to break out. A certain room with a certain patient. I shouldn't. Even his inner voice trembled as he stared at that door. However, the urge, the desire to see that patient was stronger than his sense of rationale. In a series on heavy steps, he made his way to the door, placed his right hand on the door knob and turned it to the left. With a click, the door opened, allowing the moonlight to enter the room and to illuminate a bed. It was occupied. The person lying there was a black-skinned woman with purple hair, and as soon as Ichigo saw her, he felt moisture in the corners of his eyes. It had been 2 weeks since he had woken up in what he thought was an illusion. And it had been only 5 days since he had found the one woman he knew he loved. And so, there she was, unmoving and still, Yoruichi Shihoin, lying on a bed with a blank expression on her face. She had been lobotomized. Yoruichi, Ichigo whispered in a tender voice and kneeled next to her bed so he could caress her beautiful face. I love you, he added almost inaudibly and buried his face in her shoulder, unable to stare at her empty eyes anymore. He didn't know how long he stayed there, but he only raised his head once he heard a familiar voice coming from behind him. Ah, there you are, Kurosaki-san. Took me a while to find you. Momentarily caught off guard, Ichigo's whole body snapped to the side to face the newcomer with a bewildered expression. Since the moonlight was falling on the newcomer's back, the teen was unable to see the face, but it didn't matter. He knew that voice. Urahara-san. Yeah, that's me, Kurosaki-san. Blinking dubiously, Ichigo slowly stood up. What are you doing here? The man shook his head. Never mind me. What are you doing here, Kurosaki-san? You shouldn't be here, he whispered rapidly. Ichigo just nodded in Yoruichi's direction. As a response, Urahara visibly sighed. I know it's hard to see her like this, Kurosaki-san, but we can't stay here. We both know that getting caught is the worst thing you could do while being caught in this illusion. Ichigo froze. Only through sheer shock he managed to use his voice. What did you just say? I said you shouldn't risk getting caught. Not while you're trapped in this illusion of a reality. Gulping, Ichigo dared to ignite a spark of hope inside of him and took a step towards the man. You know we're in an illusion. How did you even get here? Urahara made a gesture and, judging by the tone of his voice, the teen was sure he also grinned. It's me, remember, right now, I'm living on the threshold between this illusion and the real world. If you want to return to the Soul Society, then come with me. Right now. Just with that, Ichigo felt his breathing getting heavy, filled with incredible amount of hope. He nodded to the scientist and, once the man turned around, he hastily followed after him. We should be good for another few minutes. I made sure to get the nurses entertained for a moment. Still, try to be as quiet as possible. Yeah, sure, Ichigo replied in a subdued tone, still in disbelief of the current developments. The adrenaline in his veins was flowing fast, making him feel ready to burst at any given moment, but he suppressed the urge to yell in excitement. Still, he was unable to prevent the grin from forming on his face. I'm finally getting out of here. Maneuvering across the whole building, the two of them took one last turn around the corner before Urahara stopped in front of the door with a label, Janitor's Room. Resolutely, he opened it and walked inside. Just a second, I'll get the stuff, he muttered to the teen. Still grinning and full of energy, Ichigo began to pace in front of the doors. However, it took the scientist only a minute before he returned from the room and pushed something into the teen's hand. What is this? Urahara pointed at the door. Come inside. It's better to do it inside. Ichigo quickly got in the room and, once he closed the doors, Urahara switched the lights on. In that moment, Ichigo felt confusion quickly spreading all over his body. The speed with which it attacked his senses increased even further when he looked at the thing Urahara had pushed into his hand and then at the scientist itself. The man smiled widely, gaining a bit of an unsettling expression. What I just gave you is 100% concentrated, pure coke. The best I had in months. Feel free to form yourself a line on my desk. Snort just one and you'll instantly transport into the Soul Society. Mon, I assure you that you have never felt stuff this good in your entire life. Urahara rambled without noticing that the grin on Ichigo's face rapidly faded away and was replaced with an expression of despair. The teen blinked. He's not the Urahara Kazuki I know. This man is he's just a junkie. Something broke within his mind and his vision grew unstable. Before his body hit the ground, only one thought filled his brain. I'm all alone after all. Time is relative. For an outside observer, it seemed to pass normally, at an ordinary pace without any abnormalities or any weird fluctuations. For Ichigo, the month he had spent in the institute so far felt like a half year at the very least. It wasn't that he was unaware of the passing of the time. There was a small calendar placed on his desk and so he could easily check each day. The problem, however, was the feeling of getting squashed by the cold walls that surrounded him 24/7. The feeling of being watched every second of the day. The feeling of paranoia every time a nurse forced him to drink a couple of pills. However, all those feelings paled in comparison with something different. They all paled when compared to the sense of dread that filled the teen's stomach whenever he tried to remember his time in Soul Society. The sense of dread when he realized his memories were slowly fading away into oblivion, causing the first few memory holes to appear. He knew he wasn't crazy. The memories were still mostly there. He could still recall his first meeting with Rukia. He could still relive the moment when he first crossed blades with Kenpachi Zaraki. When he saved Rukia from execution. Aizen's treachery. Battles with the Arankars. The Winter War. All his friends in Soul Society. A woman that he loved. Another woman that yearned for his body and another woman that just wanted a companion. A war with the Quincy. He remembered it all. But were they truly his memories? While he still saw the images as clear as a day, the feelings he had felt at those times grew dull, making it hard to remain a believer of his own past self. And if his memories were devoid of any emotions, were they actually memories? What if they were just delusions? Within his dark room, Ichigo shifted on the bed so he lay on his stomach and buried his face into the pillow. No, they are not delusions. I am not crazy. And I remember emotions because I love Yoruichi. I know that, he yelled mentally and released an angry growl that got swallowed by the thick, soft cushion. Feeling of frustration once again spread into his whole body and forced him to shift his position again. His face facing the cold ceiling, he creased his brow and formed a deep scowl. I am not crazy. I am not crazy, he repeated loudly and impatiently tapped the bed with the palms of his hands. His scowl deepening, he jumped out of his bed and began to pace around his room. Quietly muttering under his breath, he ignored his surroundings and, for a while, immersed himself in his own thoughts. Then, as if on a command, his head snapped up and he turned to face the door. I have to get out of here. He mumbled softly, but there was a definite hint of desperation creeping into his voice. Firmly placing his hand on the doorknob, he pushed the door open and took one step outside. It was already night. He looked to his left. He looked to his right. The corridor was empty. Not a soul in the vicinity. Even the glow of a night shift nurse's flashlight seemed very distant. This is my chance. It's now or never. I have tried every single exit but all of them are locked. I'll have to force my way out. It was his 16th attempt to escape, but this time, Ichigo knew he wasn't going to back down as easily as before. Acting fast, in a matter of a few steps, he accelerated to his full speed and, by the time he reached a corner, he was running like a hurricane. He ignored the sound of his own footsteps, mild as they were, and sprinted towards the one exit he had analyzed as the weakest. He reached it under 5 minutes and tried to open it again, just to be sure. Locked. Ichigo narrowed his eyes and shifted his stance to face the door with his right shoulder. Glancing at the opposite side of the hallway, he took a deep breath. If he went through with his plan, he was going to make a lot of noise. But he was getting to the edge of his patience, to his breaking point, and that slowly turned him into a caged animal. And a caged animal was always the most dangerous one. Now, he leaned backwards, then put all of his weight on his left leg and burst forward. Bang! The door shook and the resulting sound echoed through the hallway like an alarm. Nevertheless, the exit remained closed. Ichigo grimaced from the bit of pain but also from the anger that slowly filled his mind. Again. Bang! What's going on? Who's there? Ichigo felt his breathing getting fast but refused to look away from his target. Not when he was so close. The door. One more time. He focused all of his energy, all of his pent-up emotions, into the last attempt and shot forward one more time. Crash! The door crash opened, causing him to fly through them like a bullet. His body sailed through the air only to stop once it hit the ground. Battered and bruised, the teen bit his lip in order not to cry out in pain and forced himself to stand up. I'm finally out. He yelled in excitement. He was standing outside the building, in what seemed like a large garden filled with trees and endless sea of flowers. The grass below him tickled his feet and a smile appeared on his face as soon as he took a deep breath of fresh air. Now break, you disgusting illusion, he exclaimed loudly, throwing every bit of caution into the air, and waited. But nothing happened. Barely a minute after he managed to get out, he heard multiple voices coming from behind him and his smile withered. There he is. Get him. Don't let him get away. Before he could move in any direction, strong hands caught him and forced his arms behind his back. No, 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 no. This isn't supposed to happen, he yelled when he felt his body being turned around to face a horde of nurses, some of them giving him angry glares and some of them giving him stares full of pity. He felt his throat drying. It's not possible. It should have ended. However, no matter how hard he tried to scream or yell, nothing ever happened, and so, after a moment, he dejectedly lowered his head and let himself get dragged inside. I was wrong. What is going on? He thought, desperately trying to understand the situation. But he was unable to do so. His brain refused to cooperate, and so he was left with staring at his own feet as they slid across the cold floor. A loud knock on a metallic door a few minutes later briefly brought him back to his senses, and he realized he wasn't being tossed into his own room. Before he was pushed inside, he noticed only a small label. The director. Yeah, put him on that chair. Should we go or stay? Ichigo blinked. There was a voice that sounded familiar. He couldn't really put his finger on it, but he was quite sure he had already heard it before. He raised his head. It was as if a lightning struck him there and then. In front of him, in a long white coat, stood the director of the Karakura Psychiatric Institute, a man with brown hair, glasses and a kind-looking face. Ichigo knew that face. Aizen. Another maid-up came. I'm the director of this institute, Kurosaki-san. I must say, I am quite displeased with your recent behavior. And you have been doing so well for the last year. I don't know what happened to you a month ago, but ever since that one day, you've been slowly turning back to your past self. The one that was rebellious and stubborn. The man said with a frown. When Ichigo didn't reply, he replaced the frown with a smile. But fear not, Kurosaki-san. For the sake of your family, I will heal your mind. I promise you that, even if it would take, Kurosaki-san. What's wrong, Kuro-arg? The man wasn't able to finish his sentence when the teen jumped out of his seat, placed his fingers around his neck and squeezed. I'll kill you. I'll fucking kill you, you bastard. Director. A pair of hands immediately grabbed Ichigo's shoulders, but he angrily kicked backwards and felt his heel hitting something squishy. Gah, let go of him. But Ichigo only increased the strength of his grip and squeezed harder. I know this is your work, Aizen. Dispel this illusion or I swear I'll strangle you to death. His face losing its color, the director tried to speak. Glarg, don't, no, talking GAAR, about. Call the others. Staring into the man's eyes as he struggled to get free, Ichigo suddenly felt something heavy hitting the back of his head and he lost the grip on the man's neck. His vision spun around and he fell backwards. An instant later, he felt a dull pain in his shoulder. Slowly losing his consciousness, he heard the director's voice. I'm all right. Get him to his room and change his medication to the ones we used to use when he was younger, but increase the dose. Weak from his evening dosage of pills, a young man with orange hair shifted on his bed and threw a listless glance at the calendar placed on the nearby desk. He blinked tiredly. How long has it been now? The date on the calendar seemed surreal and, for him, unusable. He had no idea what the year was, but it wasn't even bothering him. Dimly, he recalled that the last month he could remember was October. The month currently written on the calendar was the December. He blinked again. Oh, so it has been 2 months already. Who knew? He shifted his body again so that the desk and the calendar were no longer in his line of sight, and a confused expression briefly formed on his pale face. Wait, it has been 2 months since what? What happened 2 months ago? Lowering his eyes, he stared at his own, barely responsive body and slightly tilted his head so it made a mild contact with his shoulder. Then he blinked again and the look on his face became a bit lively. Right, this is actually an illusion. It's not real. Nothing around me is real. I come from a place called Soul Society. I fought in some kind of a war. There was blood, pain and suffering, but also love, friendship, Huh. Once again, the bit of life that creeped into his face quickly withered away and panic settled in instead. I come from Soul Society. Then, who am I? Continuing to stare at his body, he went silent for a moment. I'm Ichigo, aren't I? Yes, I'm Kurosaki Ichigo. I'm currently trapped in an illusion made by Aizen Sosuke. He hummed for a while. I met Aizen in here. He's the director. I tried to strangle him, but what for? He's just a copy, a mere illusion of the real one, and he doesn't know anything. Just like the others. Vivid images flashed within his mind. Just like Dad, Yuzu, Karen, Kiraku-san, Rukia, Yoruichi, or Urahara-san. They are all just simple illusions. They are not real, but if they are not real, then am I not real too? Am I just an illusion too? He gulped. Who am I again? Forcing his body to move, he managed to raise his right hand and rubbed his face with it. Ah, I'm Ichigo. Yeah, can't forget that again, he muttered and formed a small smile. Somehow, a feeling of happiness flowed into him as soon as he said his own name once again. That smile remained on his face even after an hour and even after he closed his eyes and finally fell asleep. Once he woke up, he was no longer sporting a smile nor he was feeling happy, but he was still able to recall his thoughts from the previous evening. Those thoughts prompted him to move his body and to get out of the bed. After lunch, when the nurse finally allowed him to move independently, he aimed his steps to a room occupied by a petite woman with relatively short black hair. Hello, Kurosaki-san. It's been a while since you last came here. Rukia welcomed him with a melancholic smile and glanced at the chair next to her bed. Ichigo dragged his body towards it and sat down. Only then he answered. I know. I'm sorry, but I've been unwell. Rukia forced her body to a sitting position and then propped herself against the wall with her legs hidden under the blanket. She placed both her hands on top of it. I see. It's been rather dull without you. I didn't even feel like killing myself for a while. Can you imagine that? She chuckled darkly and gave the teen a sad stare, causing goosebumps to form on his skin. Ichigo felt a sting of pain when he heard her words, but it soon faded away when he recalled one thing. She's not real. She's just an illusionary copy. Nothing more. As soon as he reminded that to himself, an idea struck his mind. It must have shown on his face because Rukia gave him a puzzled glance. That's probably the first time you reacted to one of my jokes. Ichigo blinked and negatively shook his head. No, I was just thinking. About what? Rukia asked with a surprising amount of penchant in her voice. In response, Ichigo met her eyes with a serious gaze. Do you really think a suicide is a way to return to Soul Society? After he said the last word, he watched in fascination as Rukia's demeanor completely changed. She literally came to life in the span of a second. Yes, I do. Are you thinking of joining me, Kurosaki-san? That would be wonderful. I could go there with somebody who has already been there. She exclaimed and gave him a smile so radiant and honest, it almost blinded him. Yet he managed to get a hold of himself as her reaction caused him to immediately think about his situation. Could I do it? Could this be a way out of here? He debated with himself. A moment later, he opened his mouth and leaned towards the woman. If I was thinking about it, how would you want to do it? To, kill yourself? He asked quietly. A reply came almost instantly. There are multiple possible ways of doing that, actually. Even here, with the janitor's help, you can overdose yourself with drugs or medicine. You can steal a knife from the cafeteria and slice your wrists with it. You can climb on the highest point of the institute and jump to death. You can release a gas through the ventilation. You can also electrocute yourself using any electric box, but you need to know how to bypass the protection. Ichigo felt a chill running down his spine while listening to Rukia as she talked about her long list of possible scenarios with such a happy expression. Still, he was also impressed. If only from the amount of methods of committing a suicide she came up with, Rukia seemed truly dedicated to her cause. Half an hour later, he left her room with a doubtful expression and with his head full of questions. Could the suicide be really the way out of here? The idea of a suicide kept returning to Ichigo's mind for the next month, each time stronger and harder to get rid of. He thought about it in the morning when he woke up, but also in the evening, just before he went to sleep. He thought about it while eating his lunch, while visiting the toilet, while swallowing his pills and while attending the regular meetings. As much as he didn't like the idea at first, it gradually became more and more interesting. As far as he could remember, he had been in the institute for 3 months already. Even then, he wasn't really sure of it. His memory wasn't what it had used to be. There were holes, serious gaps in it that he had been unable to fill with reliable images or emotions, making him more frustrated and anxious with each passing day. After a month of such mental torment, the teen had reached a final, inevitable conclusion that killing himself may not be as bad as he had thought it was. Sure, he was scared and everything, but the thought of being released from this fake reality that was slowly turning into a real one was more that he could suppress. Still, can I do it? Can I really do it? He thought as he slowly walked through a dark corridor. It was already past midnight and Ichigo was out of his room, aimlessly roaming the hallways of the institute in an attempt to gather strength and resolve to do what he was about to do. Since he had made a promise with Rukia, he wasn't going to be alone while doing so. The woman had happily agreed to join him and make it a double suicide. Nevertheless, the prospect of having a company wasn't as comforting as he had hoped it would be. I have to see her one last time, he muttered softly and, at the closest crossroads, made a sharp turn. Briskly, he made his way to a quiet room filled with a sweet scent and looked at the patient lying on the bed. Hey, Yoruichi, he whispered and walked closer to the bed, so he could see the face of the woman he loved better. I love you. I may not remember many things about you, about anything, but I know this for sure. I love you. Reaching with his hand, he moved a strand of purple hair from her face and smiled. I hope you are waiting for me because I'm finally going home, he said quietly and lowered himself to kiss her on her forehead. Instantly after doing so, he turned around and walked out. He didn't look back again. He couldn't. Swiftly, he returned to his room and grabbed a small plastic bag from his desk. He took one glance inside, to make sure he had everything, before closing the door from the outside. But before he made a step in the direction of Rukia's room, he heard a muffled hiss coming from the room next to his. It was soon followed with another one, causing Ichigo to turn around and stare at the door with a frown. Well, since I'm going to leave this place, I may as well look who is inside, he thought with a shrug and carefully approached the door. Lowering his body, he placed his mouth to a small slot and took a deep breath. I don't know who you are, but I'm opening the door, he stated firmly and began unlocking several safety chains. Once he was done, he grabbed the door knob and turned it. The door opened. What welcomed him was a pitch black. To his surprise, Ichigo saw no window in the room and so there was no source of illumination. Cautiously, he took a few steps inside. Hello, he asked with an uncertain voice and, for a moment, nobody answered him. Only once his eyes got used to the darkness and he noticed a silhouette of a person sitting on the bed. The patient replied. You must kill them all. Ichigo shivered. What? You must kill them all, the stranger repeated insistently. What are you talking about? Who are you, actually? Before he noticed it, the teen felt a pair of hands on his shoulders. He was so surprised he froze right away. You, Ichigo saw the man pointing a finger on him. Must kill. The man illustrated a stabbing motion. Everybody you care about. Ichigo felt another chill and goosebumps appeared all over his body. What? But why? He asked loudly. Somehow, in that moment, he felt as if he didn't want anything else as badly as an answer to that question. In response, the man shook him. Because you must kill. All of a sudden, Ichigo felt himself getting pushed out of the room. He tried to fight back, only to find himself overpowered. Not being able to see where he was going, the teen tripped on his own leg and fell backwards, with the man falling on top of him. They both hit the ground outside the room and the moonlight fell on the face of the stranger. Ichigo felt as if somebody knocked the wind out of him and his face paled instantly. I know you. You are Zangetsu. The one who was still clinging on to him raised his head and showed him his face filled with tears and suppressed pain. You must kill them. Zangetsu screamed as loud as possible, causing his words to echo throughout the whole institute like a siren. He's out. Call reinforcements. Ichigo gulped. Nurses began to flow through the corridor in great numbers, surrounding both him and Zangetsu in a matter of seconds. Before they grabbed him, Ichigo glanced at Zangetsu one last time. The man with the appearance of his Zanpakuto spirit gave him a pained but also a pleading look. Please, kill them all. That was the last thing Ichigo was able to hear before the horde of nurses forcibly separated him from Zangetsu. They threw Zangetsu to his own room while dragging an absolutely terrified Ichigo away. Hey, did you hear? They are transferring that orange-haired kid back to this ward. Orange hair, oh, you mean Kurosaki, right? Yeah, that one. Man, really, that's good. Not that I like him or anything, but it's been rather dull without him here. Hey, you got that right. Sometimes he was a bit hard to control, but at least it wasn't as boring as it is now. How long has it been since they took him away anyway? I think 2 months, maybe. They took him right after that incident with the patient from the room 51. Yeah, I remember that. Poor guy. I mean, it was his own fault for opening that door, but the punishment was rather harsh, don't you think? I agree. I know that until that incident, he was growing more and more disobedient, but sending him to an electroshock therapy. For 2 whole months. If he's not a pile of unresponsive flesh after that, then he can consider himself a lucky guy. Not to mention that the last guy who was sent there ended up in a vegetative state and then died shortly afterwards. We were lucky we weren't sued for that. I don't know what the director was thinking. Shish, you don't want to badmouth the director in a broad daylight. Ah, right, sorry. A short silence fell on a duo of male nurses as they left the cafeteria and entered a stairway to the 2nd floor. When they reached mezzanine, the taller one frowned. Actually, I think they should be transferring him right now. Want to go take a look at the kid? You know, to see if he's not broken. The other one glanced at him with a raised eyebrow. Really, not broken? Kind of harsh, man. The taller one rolled his eyes. Oh, come on, you know what I meant. A sigh later, the other one nodded. Yeah, sure, why not? It's not like we have anything else to do anyway. A few minutes later, when they reached the correct part of the institute, the two of them watched as a lone nurse slowly pushed forward an occupied wheelchair. Sitting in it, there was a sickly-looking young man with orange hair that seemed to continuously mutter something to himself. He gave off a sad vibe, as if he was barely aware of his surroundings. The two nurses glanced at each other and briskly approached the wheelchair. The one who was pushing it raised his head. Hey guys. Hey, so, how is the kid? The taller one greeted him and quickly moved to the point. The man briefly looked at the patient in the wheelchair and sighed. He barely knows who he is. It seems the therapy also left him delirious and paranoid. He sees deception everywhere, but, unless you get too close to him or you try to touch him, he's quite calm. The only thing he does is talk to himself in a really creepy way. Yeah, no shit. If I had to experience the same therapy, I would go truly nuts too. The smaller one muttered and shuddered. Well, yeah, but what can you do? Now, sorry guys, but I have to put him in his room. Be right back. Once he was left alone in his room, Ichigo slowly turned his head around and a disturbing smile formed on his face. With glazed eyes, he brought his trembling hands up to his chin and tapped it with his fingers. Yes, good, I know. He mumbled and went silent for a moment, looking like he was trying to listen to somebody invisible. You're right, there is nothing else I can do. If this is real, then I don't want to live. His smile widened. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll gather every guest and then I'll kill them all. He said with a chuckle. After that, he closed his eyes and let his consciousness drift away. The next morning, he woke up at the usual time. The nurse came to him with his morning pills at the usual time. She took him on a short stroll. As usual, until lunch, everything proceeded ordinarily. Once he was brought to the cafeteria, he glanced at his nurse. Nurse, yes, sweetie, I'd like to see my family today. Could you call them for me? She smiled softly at him. Of course, sweetie, she said, and, after she brought him his lunch, left to make a phone call from the phone booth in the corner of the room. Watching her go, Ichigo acted quickly. He grabbed his wheels and moved towards a lone man near the trash bins. Urahara-san. Ah, Kurosaki-san, I believe you're feeling better. Yes, I am. The teen replied and leaned closer to the man, prompting him to do the same. I have a plan for today's late evening. Want to help me? The janitor raised one eyebrow but seemed interested. What kind of plan? Ichigo formed a conspiratorial grin. I wish for everyone to feel what it's like to be in Soul Society. Urahara's eyes twinkled. Very nice. I'm in. How are we going to do it? Ichigo turned his head and looked at the ceiling, at the ventilation that ran through the whole institute, and then back at the man. I will use the ventilation system to spread out a coke powder to the whole building. Ooh, nice. How can I help? You'll just make sure that every fan is turned on and that no air can leave the building. That means every window has to be not just closed but also locked. Same for doors. Urahara hummed to himself. Can you do it? Ichigo asked quietly. When exactly? And do you have enough coke? Urahara responded after a few seconds of thinking. Ichigo nodded. We'll do it when my family gets here. I want them to experience the same thing, and yes, I do have enough. Don't worry about it, Ichigo whispered, causing Urahara to grin. He extended his right hand and waited until the teen shook it. We have a deal, Kurosaki-san. Once your family enters the meeting room, you can throw the coke in. You know what the best place is, right? Yeah, I know. Satisfied with the answer, Urahara then winked at him and left. Seeing him go, Ichigo's grin slowly turned from a conspiratorial one to a nasty one. Soon, it'll be all over. Sweetie, there you are. I just finished talking with your father. He agreed to take your sisters and meet you today at 6 p.m. Evening came quickly and, as it was still winter, the darkness had already settled in. Most of the patients were safely within their rooms. Most but not all. One patient, an orange-haired young man, stealthily walked forward while making sure nobody saw him. I'm getting close, Ichigo thought, and walked right past large doors leading to the institute kitchen. Once he passed a window with a view inside it, he stopped and entered another room. I hope fake Urahara-san made the preparations. He mumbled and moved towards a large box in the background. It was an air handling unit. He took a long look at it. And then he turned his head and looked at several LPG cylinders placed next to a wall. I'm sorry, fake Urahara-san, but it's not coke I'm going to distribute to everybody today. I have to do what's necessary, he stated wickedly, his creepy grin returning in full force. Resolutely, he moved towards the cylinders and began to drag them towards the air handling unit, one by one. Time for everyone to die, he said. Despite his best attempts to suppress it, he began to laugh. A bit later, he entered the meeting room in his wheelchair, barely able to conceal his grin. He waited only for a minute before the door opened and his father and his sisters walked inside. Son, Dad. The door behind them closed and the ventilation fans above him began to spin. Now I wait, Ichigo thought and, seemingly without any worries, engaged his father in a light conversation. During it, he tried his best not to look at his sisters. He couldn't. Despite the delirium he was in, he was unable to look at them without breaking down, especially when he knew what was about to happen. Only a few minutes later, he saw the nurse standing in the corner of the room scrunch his nose and sniff the air with a confused expression. 2 minutes later, the man began to sway only to topple over. At the sound of his body hitting the ground, Isshin turned around. When he saw the man, he jumped out of his seat only to seemingly recognize the smell in the air. Gas, he whispered in a mixture of surprise and fear. Immediately, he ran towards the door in an attempt to open them only to find them closed. Ichigo watched in a bizarre fascination as the man started to run around the room to try and open any door or any window. Unfortunately for him, all windows were too high and, same as in the whole institute, covered with protective steel bars. Save your energy, Dad. You can't save yourself, Ichigo said calmly, causing the man to freeze in a spot. What did you just say? Ichigo smiled. Don't worry, soon, we will all return to the real world. Both of them coughed. The gas was starting to drop down, affecting even the teen in the wheelchair. In that moment, alarms went off in the whole institute. You did this? Isshin asked in disbelief and his legs wobbled. Ichigo ignored his sisters and continued to look at his father. Yes, no, Ishin muttered and tried to take a step towards him only to faint and fall on the ground. Ichigo looked at him for one more second before finally turning his head and settling his stare at his two terrified sisters. "Daddy, Dad," both of them cried and tried to move towards him only for Ichigo to grab them and envelop them in a tight hug. "Shush, it's all right. Don't worry, it'll all be over very soon." Ichigo felt dizzy. His head was starting to get light, his vision began to fade away. He looked at his sisters one more time, only to find them not breathing. They were already dead. For a moment, time froze for him. He just stared at their faces, at the two innocent angels, with a blank expression. He felt tears forming in the corners of his eyes. A split second later, his world exploded and, along with it, the lock on his emotions did so too. He screamed at the top of his lungs. He screamed to try and get rid of all the pain. Then he fainted. Oblivion. A state where a person's consciousness ceases to exist. A state that Kurosaki Ichigo wasn't allowed to enter. Not yet. Where am I? He asked himself as soon as he realized the nothingness around him. He tried to move his head so he could look elsewhere, only to discover he had no head at all. No eyes, no senses, no body. He just was. Then, all of a sudden, he heard a voice. "You truly are persistent, Kurosaki Ichigo." He recognized the voice. Immediately, he tried to retort but couldn't. The scenery in front of him began to swiftly transform. He blacked out. Ichigo, come on, wake up. Don't you dare die on me, you sexy strawberry." On the edge of his consciousness, Ichigo heard a determined female voice calling out to him. Weak and confused, he forced his eyes to open. As soon as he did, somebody gasped and enveloped him in a hug so tight, he felt his ribs protesting. But before he could voice his discomfort, he heard somebody crying. "You damn orange-haired idiot. You almost gave me a heart attack." The voice, coupled with the large amount of purple hair covering his face, forced his brain to restart. "Yoruichi. What? Where am I?" A second later, images of a nightmare played out in his mind like a horror movie and he felt panic swelling within his heart. Quickly, he raised his hands and returned the hug. "Yoruichi, I came back. I'm so glad. I'm so damn glad." "You came back? From where?" she responded in a confused tone, still unable to let go of him. Ichigo chuckled despite feeling like crying. The nightmare was over, but what he had felt during it was still raw. He felt as if his heart had been torn to pieces. "Doesn't matter, but I promise you I will never leave you again. If I do, I will die. If I do, I will kill everyone." Chapter 27. Also wandered got contingency plans. For just a moment, he turned a blind eye and a deaf ear to the world around him. No amount of thunderous noise could penetrate the blanket of peace he felt just by looking at the face of his beloved. There was nothing more important than to truly believe that the reality he was in was real. To believe in the realness of his rose on a battlefield that kept him from falling through the gates of oblivion. Like a drunkard in delirium, he raised his hand and gently reached for her face, afraid she might flicker out of existence as if she was just an illusion of a perfection, a perfect illusion. He leaned into her and placed his nose next to her nape. With his fingertips, he felt her warmth. With his nose, he felt her scent. Emotion he didn't recognize welled within his chest and hurt him softly, a thin ribbon squeezing his heart. He welcomed the pain, greeted it with open arms. It made him feel alive. Alive and real. Releasing a short breath, a small smile settled on his mouth. "I really am back." He gave her a quick squeeze and a peck on her cheek. A moment later, he was back on his feet. Shaken to his very core, damaged from within but also determined. Haunting thoughts and crippling images had to wait until he was finished. "You were way too stubborn, Kurosaki Ichigo." At the sound of a certain man's voice, he fought against a tremor in his hands and clasped the handle of his zanpakuto. In one swift motion, he brought the sword in front of him and pointed its tip towards the owner of the voice. Ichigo was done taking things nice and slow. Careful approach was never his thing in the first place. "Let me be clear on this, Aizen. I know what your sword hides from the world for you and, once upon a time, it made me pity you. Now, I just don't give a damn. I had enough of you." He ignored the man's scoff and the following smirk and briefly closed his eyes. Zangetsu. I'm here, Ichigo. Ready when you are. When his eyes snapped open, Ichigo addressed his next words to the woman next to him. Yoruichi, I am going to go wild. He felt a slight touch on his shoulder and then a sound of a shunpo signaled that Yoruichi understood and cleared the area before she would get caught up in the fire. Literally. A second later, tendrils of black flames erupted both from Ichigo's Zanpakuto and his body, creating an image of a blinding black sun. Tiny particles of a scorched ground began to slowly disintegrate under the force of heavy Raryoku wildly gushing out of him. You called these flames of the damned, right? He called out to Aizen, who was carefully watching him with squinted eyes. The thumb on his sword hand twitched. Before the involuntary movement ended, Ichigo managed to flash across the battlefield and land right in front of the former Gote captain. It's time for you to taste their flavor. Anjutsu no Ka. Despite moving almost as fast as Ichigo did, Aizen couldn't completely avoid getting touched by his black flames. Not when Ichigo let them explode from his body like a bomb that covered the whole battlefield with its blackness. Satisfied, the teen watched as Aizen's eyes widened and a spasm in one of his legs caused him to trip in the middle of his high-speed movement. That is my true Shinigami power, Aizen. Do you like it? Do you like what you see? Ichigo asked in a hard tone when he saw Aizen shake in obvious discomfort. The man was breathing heavily and pain was reflected in his eyes. Still, he slowly managed to get back on his feet. A chuckle escaped his lips. Ichigo narrowed his eyes. Your Shinigami powers, Kurosaki Ichigo. Ha, that is truly ironic. He was seconds away from unleashing more of his power, when an odd tone of Aizen's voice piqued his curiosity and got the better of him. What is? Aizen shuddered and nodded towards the black flame licking his torso. It's ironic that you would take flames of hell, born from Yuacha's imprisonment in hell's subdimension, as your Shinigami powers when, in truth, they are of Quincy origin. Ichigo blinked in surprise but Aizen wasn't finished. It's ironic, because they were originally a holy power but, thanks to the Shinigami's tainted influence, they turned into something vile and poisoned the very father of Quincy. It's ironic, because it was supposed to kill him yet, in the end, it just made him that much stronger. When Ichigo didn't react, Aizen shot the final nail in the coffin. It's ironic, because you sound so proud when, in reality, it just turned you into a twisted, failed copy of the one you were fighting against. The man said, sounding almost triumphal. For a moment, silence fell between the two of them, broke only by Aizen's irregular breathing. Withdrawn from the world, Ichigo spoke to his Zanpakuto spirit. Zangetsu, I can hear your Quincy powers talking to me, Ichigo. He says he didn't know. He is a mirror image of Yuach from a long time ago, before he fell in the battle against the Soul King. Does it really matter though? Ichigo sent him a mental smile. Not really. I know who I am. Aizen's words can no longer reach me or disturb me. His Bankai was the last thing he will ever get me with. I just wanted to hear you after what seemed like years for me. And, without warning, he tightened his grip on his Zanpakuto and slashed upwards. It gives me an element of surprise. Aizen without contingency plans is a predictable Aizen. Like in slow motion, the two halves of the former captain moved in different directions and fell on the dusty ground with a dull sound. Gah, coughing blood, Aizen rolled over his upper half and glared at the teen. I see. You have changed even more than I thought, Kurosaki Ichigo. A bright light erupted from both halves of Aizen's body, causing the heavy bleeding to stop. Once that happened, thin ribbons of light began to look for each other in an attempt to try and reconstruct his body anew. It changes and nothing though. As I've told you many times before, I am immortal, Kurosaki Ichigo. You may chop me up, you may grind my body to dust, but you cannot kill me. Hogyoku will not allow it. Watching the man squirm and twitch in pain, Ichigo didn't react to his words. Seemingly deep in thoughts, he simply raised his sword and plunged it in Aizen's slowly reconstructing abdomen with enough force to completely pierce it through. When he felt the tip of the blade embedding itself into the ground, he squeezed the hilt until his knuckles turned white. Aizen gasped and more blood spurted from his mouth. Ichigo gritted his teeth and resolutely closed his eyes. Then he spoke. You are putting way too much faith in the Hogyoku, Aizen. Way too much faith in its indestructibility. Yes, for now, I can't break it. But I'm no longer an uneducated teen fumbling in the darkness. I know what the Hogyoku is and what it represents. He felt Aizen's breathing for just a split second. I see. So, just like Urahara Kazuki, you've seen it. You've seen the Soul King. The relic that. I met him and talked to him. Ichigo interrupted the man and looked him straight in the eyes. For the first time ever, he saw Aizen speechless, unable to react in any way. He just stared at Ichigo with completely blank expression, seemingly unable to process Teen's words. You won't be immortal forever, Aizen, and, until that moment comes, I am content with simply keeping you down, here with me, restrained and unable to participate in this war in any way. Aizen finally seemed to recover from his shock and his face twisted into a grimace. Spitting blood, he raised his hands and gripped the blade of Ichigo's Zanpakuto that was still keeping him pinned to the ground. Kurosaki Ichigo. Ichigo just shook his head and kept his grip on the hilt. You will not get out of here, Aizen. Anjutsu no Ka. Calmly reciting the name of his ability, Ichigo smoothly raised his Reiatsu output and poured a large amount of Raryoku into his Zanpakuto, causing it to light up with black flames, forcing a scream to escape from Aizen's mouth. He didn't try to restrain his power and hit the man with as much punishment as he could muster and stomach. Even then, his flames were unable to burn Aizen's powerful body. The man's scream was caused by something else. Something he could see only. A dream. A nightmare. A perfect illusion he could not escape from. At that moment, Ichigo heard another voice coming at him from the right side. Very interesting, Kurosaki Ichigo. I approve of your choice of restraints. For now, though, I will take over the traitor. As much as I hate to play the role of a meager carrier, a message came from the Zero Division and it is addressed to your ears only. Tattered and slightly limping, a captain of the 12th Division slowly walked up to him, showing him a unique hell butterfly in his open hand. Ignoring the teen's surprise as well as Aizen's screams, he pushed it in Ichigo's free hand and then disinterestedly turned his head towards his new test subject. Receiving an even bigger shock, Ichigo heard the message playing in his mind. A message that was told in the voice of Soul King himself. Kurosaki Ichigo, listen very closely and carefully. This message will play only once and then it will self-destruct. It is imperative that none other person will know of its contents or else everything will be lost. You are the only one immune, the only one who can hear this. Therefore, listen, there is a way to defeat Yhwach and, at the same time, ensure the survival of this carefully balanced reality. He is coming. Above Seraiti, high above the borders of Shikanmaku, where nothing but the sky existed, a black blob of tangible energy continued to fall at incredible pace. Pushed and blasted from the Soul Society's most sacred place, the blob contained the main reason behind the current war, the head of the Wandenreich and the king of Quincy. Yhwach. Soon, the blob crashed into the Reishi barrier with a force it should not have possessed and tore through it with barely any resistance. Yet neither broke apart. The small hole in the barrier repaired itself slower than usual but it still held and the blob continued in its fall. It took only seconds before its journey ended in a form of a crash landing in the middle of Seraiti. The area of the landing site seemed to be abandoned, devoid of any presence. Ever so slowly, the blackness of the blob receded and vanished into thin air, leaving its passengers free of its oppressive boundaries. The largest passenger, a man with long black hair and a mustache that was neither thick nor thin, opened his eyes. A bored expression formed on his face. What now, Your Majesty? The man, Yhwach, reacted to the question with a slight movement of his head. Now, Hashwolf, now, we walk, he said and took a step forward. His words held no answer but his white-haired aide accepted it immediately. Bowing down, he followed his king without hesitation. The word of God was absolute. They both managed to take only that one step before a fiery figure landed not far but also not close to them. There were waves of hot Reiatsu pouring out the person. His energy was so heavy, so scorching, the land around him seemed to be on fire. Yet the god didn't care, for his kingdom was slowly coming. Genryusai Shigekuni Yamamoto, the captain commander of the Gote 13. I thought your long life had taught you a lesson on being a fool. The strongest Shinigami that had been born in the past 1,000 years looked at him with pure contempt. The only one being a fool is you, Yhwach. he said and raised his sword, causing Yawatch to laugh. What are you going to do, Shigekuni Yamamoto? Challenge me with your useless stick. You are but a Shinigami. Without your Zanpakuto, you are to me what everyone else is, an ant to be squashed. Yamamoto narrowed his eyes. Do not underestimate Shinigami, Yawatch, because that will be your downfall. Ryujin Jaka is just an outlet for my power, he said while releasing waves of blazing Reiatsu. Unfortunately for him, it didn't impress the leader of Quincy. What is a bit of Reiatsu to a god? Yamamoto vanished from his position and reappeared right in front of Yawatch with his sword moving sideways. The father of all Quincy allowed himself a mocking smile. Just when he was about to get hit, the steel of Yamamoto's sword met the steel of a thin sword held by Yawatch's aide. The resulting clash vibrated the air with a subdued sound. Out of the way, small fry. The captain commander growled and pushed harder. Hashwalth's sword moved but he managed to keep his cool. Should I dispose of him, your majesty? Yawatch formed a malicious grin. If you can, Hashwalth, but make it as humiliating as possible. Nodding to his king, Hashwalth pushed back. Arrogant. Far too arrogant, Yawatch. Yamamoto grunted, visibly annoyed. Yawatch didn't respond. How could a god be arrogant when arrogance itself was a property of lesser beings? Lesser beings to whom Shinigami belonged to. Just like Yamamoto, the captain commander of Gote 13. His arrogance was questioning the arrogance of others. In it, he became arrogant. He became ignorant. Ignorance was a bliss but he was denied of even that. With horror written in his eyes, Yamamoto watched as Hashwalth's sword cut through the blade of his spiritless Zanpakuto and broke it to 2 pieces, instantly turning it into useless pieces of steel. However, being who he was, Yamamoto recovered and immediately let go of the hilt. Putting his anger into his fists, he strained his muscles and shot both his arms straight at Hashwalth's torso. Sokatsu. His fists dug into his target and Yawatch's second in command was sent skidding backwards. However, instead of turning into dust, like Yamamoto expected him to, he just coughed up a bit of blood. The powerful attack ripped his clothes and a web-like pattern became visible on his skin. Yawatch raised one eyebrow. In return, Hashwalth sent him an apologetic nod. I will immediately adjust the strength of the blood, your majesty. Ignoring their exchange, Yamamoto's brow twitched in fury. He refused to believe he truly became so weak that he couldn't defeat a simple subordinate like Hashwalth. Readying his stance, he shot towards the white-haired Quincy once more but his eyes widened when a fist embedded itself into his gut and instantly stopped him in his tracks. Very good Hashwalth. Now, Shigekuni Yamamoto, after your precious Zanjutsu and Hakuda, what else is there in you? The fist in his gut was quickly replaced with a blade of a thin sword. Yamamoto hatefully looked at Yawatch and a tiny river of blood poured out of his mouth. Then he growled, completely disregarding the steel piercing his abdomen, his right hand shot out and squeezed Hashwalth's throat, taking the Quincy by surprise. I'll tell you what else is in me. Determination. If I have to go down, I'll be taking you with me. After a quick incantation, his hand turned black and a single crack appeared in it. Fully powered Hado number 96. Ito Kaso. Not even you can escape unscathed. A massive pillar of red fire erupted from the ground in the shape of a katana's tip, completely swallowing all 3 of them in a cataclysmic explosion that instantaneously obliterated a good portion of Seraiti. Within the epicenter of the blast, the god just laughed. His word was absolute. The captain commander of the Gote 13 was dying a humiliating death after failing to realize his one little mistake. It was his second time using the same sacrificing Kido. The god knew and, therefore, the god was prepared. Therefore, the god squashed the stubborn ant and continued to walk. At the edges of a large crater, the remnant of Yamamoto's last attack, the god briefly stopped walking. Fooled to the very end, Shigekuni Yamamoto. He did not regret his actions. He did not pity the squashed ant. This was just him giving a last nod to the enemy that had fingers in delaying his plans for almost a millennium. Not worthy his respect, yet worthy of dealing with personally. Thus, God walked again. His steps echoed across the noisy Seraiti like a thunder, yet nobody dared to cross his path. He was the god, too frightening for heathens. And so, the god continued to walk through the non-heaven, the artificial nightmare for poor souls, undeterred and uninterrupted. But he was a god and so he knew he couldn't walk forever. His presence was a stain in the eyes of pagans. Not even being a god would keep them from approaching him. Eventually, the strongest of the remaining fake gods of death would confront him. Eventually, they would learn that being a god was different from being the god. Eventually, they would be punished and banished. Eventually, this fake kingdom built on lies, deception and betrayal would fall. Nobody could stop it, not even his son, born in darkness. The god ceased walking. From the darkness of his shadow, a blade, followed by an arm, shot up and tickled a single strand of his mustache. In the last fraction of a second, Hashwalth's sword prevented it from reaching any further. Immediately, a whole person stepped out of the shadow and stared straight at you. Watch. I honestly did not think you could react to it, Quincy. Shunsui Kyoraku, the captain of the 8th Division. Hashwalth recited calmly, forcing the man in flowery kimono to take a casual step back. I apologize, but I thought being polite would only be rude. Not to mention my lady was getting impatient, Kyoraku said while giving his Zanpakuto a warm smile. But then, in a matter of a second, his expression changed into a bone-chilling grimace with a smile so wide, it seemed impossible. But now she's all warmed up. Irony, white, he exclaimed right after throwing away his flowery kimono. Before his prized piece of clothing hit the ground, his sword was already falling down on Hashwalth. Clad fully in white, Hashwalth hastily brought his own sword up and managed to block the strike. Yet the power behind it folded his arm like a twig and Kyoraku's blade slashed him across the torso. Blood spurted from his body, making him stare at it in shock. Now, don't act so surprised, Quincy. You have data on our abilities so you should have known you were supposed to evade that. Only then Kyoraku noticed the web-like pattern on Hashwalth's skin. Yes, not even your special defense can protect you. My Zanpakuto doesn't abide by usual laws of Reiatsu against Reiatsu, Raryoku against Raryoku. Once you are in its grasp, you cannot cheat. He explained and then vanished, only to reappear behind Hashwalth while already spinning around. White, Freund chilled. Kyoraku's Zanpakuto dug deep into Hashwalth's back, almost revealing the white of the man's spine, when a hefty and bulky shield materialized on Yuacha's aide's left arm. The captain of the 8th Division carefully watched the accessory. Interesting choice of defense. Maybe you should have turned around before creating it, though. Kyoraku remarked quietly, only to feel intense pain in his own back. He saw and felt his blood leaving his body. Pushed a step backward, he lowered his torso and glanced up at Hashwalth. The Quincy, while still bleeding from his wound on his chest, seemed fine otherwise. Kyoraku quickly realized that the wound he had given the man disappeared. Despite the situation, he managed a grin. I see, so you have a cheat that doesn't count as a cheat. That's just cruel cheating, Quincy. Hashwalth glanced at the motionless Yuach that had been watching their fight and then opened his mouth. No cheating, Captain. You were just unlucky that you were lucky enough to wound me. Kyoraku's grin widened. Ah, finally an opponent as cryptic and full of secrets as I deserve. I assume your shield is responsible for transferring the wound I gave you back to me. Hashwalth ran his hand across the gash across his chest and twitched in pain. You assume correctly. Like all Stern Ritters, I possess a shrift as well. Mine is B, as in, balance. Waiting in silence for a few more seconds, Kyoraku sighed. I suppose that's the extent of information you are going to give me, huh, Quincy? Seeing as you have more information on us, I would like to say that is not fair, but we both know there is nothing fair in a war. Am I right? Hashwalth didn't respond immediately. Instead, he first observed Kyoraku's face. Truly, nothing is fair. Just like deception. Just like killing the leader of the opposing military. I must say I'm surprised, Captain. I thought you would be more upset at the death of your mentor, Genryusai Yamamoto. For the first time during their fight, Kyoraku's face betrayed his emotions as his eyes darkened and his grin dried a little. Yamajii knew his final day was coming and that he may not survive the second war with Quincy. Before coming here, I spent a few last moments as his pupil and made peace with his death. Now, I am the captain of the Gote 13. He stated in deep voice and raised his reiatsu to match his words. Jumping into the air, he brought his blade down on Hashwolf once more. Takaoni. The white-haired Quincy didn't even attempt to shield himself and let Kiraku's slash his shoulder. An instant later, Kiraku's shoulder erupted in a fountain of blood. I already told you, Captain, cutting me up won't change a thing. Are you sure? Hashwolf's eyes widened when he heard Kiraku's voice coming from behind him while Kiraku in front of him dispersed into thin air. Moving fast, he spun around, only to see Kiraku watching him with narrowed eyes. I see. I wondered, how does that shield of yours work, Quincy? How does it know to whom it should transfer your wounds? Is it based on my Reiatsu, or is it based on your senses perception, like, for example, vision? Kiraku asked. His shoulder was intact. Hashwolf squinted his eyes at him. Does it really matter? We are still at impasse. You are still unable to win this fight. None of the injuries you can give me will stay on my body. Kiraku renewed his grin and just sunk into his shadow. In his place, a dozen of his clones jumped from the shadows on the battlefield and each swung their blade on the Quincy. Unable to block or parry every single blade, Hashwolf received numerous cuts, some shallow but some deeper. He was already raising his sword when each clone dispersed into thin air, leaving no copy or any trace of Kiraku on the scene. His legs shook under the burden of all the injuries and pain. Ha! Very clever trick, Captain, very clever. But not clever enough, he muttered, and a bright light enveloped his body. As if in response to that, Kiraku fell down from a nearby shadow. Immediately, Hashwolf raised his shield and transferred all his injuries onto him. But Kiraku dispersed into air once more. Another clone, Captain. The real Kiraku slowly crawled out of a different shadow with an unreadable expression plastered across his face. Can't be too careful, Quincy. What was it that you did? It almost forced me out of my hiding place. I only managed to swap places with my clone in the last moment. Hashwolf lowered his shield. I already told you my shrift, Captain. Balance. Kiraku stared at him for a full minute, before a sigh crawled out of his throat and he lazily sat down. Making himself comfortable on the ground, he calmly placed his hands on his knees and took a deep breath. It was almost as if he thought of the battlefield like his new home. But he didn't. You are giving me no choice, Quincy. I cannot best you, but I also cannot let you through. Neither of you can go any further if I want to avoid any more bloodshed. He said. Hashwolf remained careful. So, what now? Kiraku just lowered his face. Now, Quincy. Now it's time for a tragedy. His Reiatsu rose even higher. Bankai. Kaden Kyokutsu. Karamatsu Shinju. The god wanted to walk again. But he could wait. There was no hurry. He could delay his plans for a little while longer. Because he was the god. Hashwolf was paying every bit of his attention to the man in front of him. He was not afraid. With Yawatch at his side as his general, there was nothing that could scare him. But he was witnessing a rare occurrence and he could not afford being careless. They had quite an extensive information on the main members of Gote 13, as the long years spent on gathering intelligence had proved very fruitful. However, even then, they had been unable to ascertain what the Bankai of 8th Division Captain actually was and did. They had been unable to find even its name. It seemed Kiraku Shunsui had never actually used it in real fight or in public. He never had to. Even when he had become a captain, it had been on personal recommendation of the captain commander, and so no display of his Zanpakuto power had been needed. But he used it now, against him. Hashwolf had enough personal integrity to admit he might have felt just a bit honored. However, the feeling lasted only until he felt an eerie atmosphere slowly forming around the man, washing over the surroundings with its bleak and suffocating Reiatsu like a wave of a dusty wind. Even the sunlight gradually became dimmer and dimmer until the day turned into a night, where everything became a living shadow, a potential death trap. Feeling a tad gloomy, melancholic even, Quincy. Is it a bit too dark for you? Kiraku asked while tiredly rising from the ground. Hashwolf opted for no response. I see. Do not worry, though. Despair will come soon enough. First act. Tamarikazu no Wakachiai. The captain chanted and glided through the shadows with both swords at the ready. Hashwolf was unsure of himself for a moment and parried the first few strikes, but when nothing seemed to be happening, he lowered his sword and let Kyoraku's Zanpakuto cut his body several times. Clearing his mind through the pain, he quickly transferred his wound to the captain. Kyoraku staggered a bit when blood oozed from his body. Once it soaked his clothes with its red color. However, he coughed and formed a low smile. Pain attacked Hashwalth from every direction as the wounds he just transferred came back to him and tore into his body like hot claws of iron. What is this? He mumbled through gritted teeth. Quincy, do you know the story of a man that betrays his partner and turns on him? A man that brings upon his partner pain, agony, only to receive the same. A man who, in doing so, is unable to die from those wounds and is forced to suffer eternally. Hashwalth raised his head only to see Kyoraku speaking again. Second act. Zenki no Shiton. If the pain he had been feeling until that moment was agonizing, it was nothing compared to what came next. Trying to stop himself from crying out, he saw black spots appearing all over his body, bringing even more pain than before. The story continued. Kyoraku said in a sad tone. The man, shamed by the wounds that were inflicted upon him, overcome with that shame, lays himself down, cowering in bed and is stricken with an incurable disease. Rapidly blinking away the darkness, Hashwalth's body glowed in a bright light, but his condition did not change. He was quickly getting weaker and the pain was making it difficult to even breathe. I am afraid even your shrift won't help you, Quincy. You and the whole area around us is now under influence and control of Kaden Kyokutsu. Trying to cheat your way out would be like trying to lift a wave of water with your bare hands. Hashwalth fought against the pain and sent a hateful glare at the captain. Pushing himself, he raised his sword and slowly walked towards Kyoraku, only to stop when he saw him shaking his head. It is futile. Kaden Kyokutsu's laws are absolute. Third act. Dengyo no Fuchi. It came out of nowhere. A massive amount of water engulfed everyone and everything within the borders of Kyoraku's Bankai like an endless abyss hungry for darkness. Though the water wasn't weighing on him with its wetness, Hashwalth felt his body slowly getting unresponsive, as if he was standing amidst the deepest crevice of a foreign ocean. Like a seafood getting crushed by ocean's incredible pressure. Kyoraku continued his story, their actions dawning upon them. The two men cast their bodies into the water gushing forth, until both their reiatsu completely expire. The captain said while breathing heavily. He was clearly trying to resist the water's pressure just like Hashwalth was. Realizing that small tidbit of information, Hashwalth gathered every bit of strength he could muster and tried to fight against the tint of helplessness that was swirling around him, invisible yet palpable. Moving like a martyr nailed to a cross, the Quincy Grand Master advanced with the speed of a snail, leaving a red trail of blood behind his broken body. He was Yuacha's aide, the left hand of the god. Losing was not an option. Even if his body would get mangled beyond recognition, he could and would fight. There was no other way. Because, being the second half of Yuach, he felt honor. Because, being the god's half, he felt compelled to defeat his enemies, were they believers or simple heathens. If it was another time, I would congratulate you, Quincy. Your determination while facing Karamatsu Shinju is incredible. However, Kaden Kyokutsu's compassion is that of a woman and a woman's compassion can be cruel. Kyoraku said as he watched Hashwalth trying to move towards him. Slowly pulling his hands away from his Zanpakuto, he grabbed a thin thread of white energy that was coming from his sword's hilt. No longer leaving an ear open to the man she adores, now, around her throat shines but a damp, white thread of her lingering affection. He raised the hand in which he held the thin white energy and gave Hashwalth a fixed stare. With every bit of remaining adoration, I'll cast it off with my very hands. This unsightly, entangled, thread of passion. Entering the scene, I present you with the grand finale of Lover's Suicide. Final act. Itokirabasumi Chizo no Nodabu. Giving no room nor time to evade him, Kyoraku flashed along the Quincy Grand Master and winded the white thread around the man's throat. With a final slash, he pulled it. Hashwalth's eyes bulged out of his skull. A foreign energy entered a cut on his throat and expanded it grotesquely. A one last thought ran through his mind. His head exploded. Watching the scene unfold, the god felt a familiar energy returning back to his soul. He could feel everything. Emotions swelled up within him. He recognized many of them and welcomed them. Welcome home. Then he sent them to a trap, into a tiny chest with an unbreakable seal, from which they couldn't escape so that he never had to encounter them again. It was his final nod to the man that had served him for a long time. Once he was done with that, he looked at a tired-looking captain. The man was returning his gaze without flinching. A heathen. Well done, Shunsui Kyoraku. I applaud your accomplishment, however, that's as far as you can go. The captain licked his lips and then tightened his jaw. Yes, it seems so. I was trying to apply my abilities on you the whole time as well, but it seems like your aide managed to use some of his power after all. He pulled back everything I threw at you back to him, forcing him to suffer twice as much as he had to. That is some amazing loyalty, he stated. The god grinned. I expected nothing less from him. He shall live in me for all eternity. Careful, you watch. Eternity is a long time. You won't be getting that much of it. The god laughed. Who is going to stop me? You. Can you use your Bankai one more time? Do you think it will affect me? That I needed Hashwalt's protection. Look at you, Captain. You were barely standing. Kyoraku managed to form a hard glare, but it got quickly replaced with a tired smile. Lowering his arms, he let go of the last bit of strength he had within his body and let his body fall backwards. Hey, I guess you were right. But before his body could hit the ground, a pair of hands appeared behind him and caught him. Rest now, you did enough. Hearing the sound of multiple shunpo, Kyoraku allowed himself to take a breath. Yes, I guess I did, huh. In a different part of Seraiti, Ichigo nervously paced around. It has been a few minutes since the oppressive aura receded from the area and he could think clearly yet again. Occasionally, he glanced to a distant location from where he could still feel a lingering presence of his own Raryoku, and his hands formed fists. Then it happened. I was wondering where they hid you, Kurosaki Ichigo, my son born in darkness. Ichigo turned towards the person that appeared in front of him. There, unharmed, stood the leader of the enemy, you watch. The person whom he had to fight against. A god. But what was a god to a non-believer? Chapter 28. Deicide, Death of the False God. He knew he would eventually come, whether it was for this or that reason. He knew he would come and overwhelm him with his presence. That he could may even knock him to his knees, cause a ringing in his ears or force him out of breath. It was to be expected. Yuwatch was, for all intents and purposes, quite literally a god. However, facing the man himself, being in his immediate vicinity, Ichigo was unprepared for the reaction of his own self. Once he saw the man appearing in front of him, every fiber in his body screamed at him. Alarms rang within his mind and poured a loud buzzing in his ears. His Zanpakuto spirit was silent, yet there were voices trying to talk to him, trying to reach him. He couldn't understand any of them. To him, every word sounded like gibberish, like a distorted screech of an electronic tool, chilling him to the very bones. Cold grew within him, entered his limbs, leaked in his veins and made him feel as if his skin was under barrage of chili pins and needles. Like a poison of a soul, it spread from his body to his mind, finally reaching his conscious thoughts and compelling him to move. Towards the god, towards his fate. I was wondering where they hid you, Kurosaki Ichigo, my son born in darkness. For the moment, Ichigo knew he couldn't rely on his emotions. They were too wild, too raw for him to handle. He couldn't listen to Yuwatch. Whatever the man said and would say, Ichigo had to let the words just pass through him so they wouldn't linger for too long and affect him. Many were relying on him. I wasn't hiding, just waiting for you to come to me. I knew you wouldn't pass up the opportunity to try and break my resolve. Yuwatch laughed. Indeed, Ichigo, it was our fate, to meet face to face, right here and right now. I know, I've seen it in my future. You are not the only one. Ichigo thought to himself. Interesting. Aizen always claimed he had plans for everything. You, on the other hand, claim you can see the future. It seems I can't catch a break and face a simple maniac. He said, carefully eyeing his surroundings. Yuwatch opened his arms, almost as if waiting for a hug. You misunderstand, Ichigo. I cannot see the future. I only see the future of one person. Myself. And I just happen to be in your vision. Yuwatch lowered his arms and the laughter in his face died down. I was not just trying to be dramatic when I called you my son born in darkness, Ichigo, because you literally are in darkness to me. I can see every potential future of my being, yet every future where you appear, simply ceases to exist. There are many possibilities for that. One of those is that you join me and remain at my side forever. He stated and took a step forward, towards Ichigo. Almost on reflex, Ichigo's legs twitched and he slightly switched his stance, ready to dodge or evade anything that could come his way. You should try and think of another possibility, you watch, because the one you just mentioned is quite the nonsense. I would never join you. Giving him a studying gaze, you watch went quiet for a moment. Then the black of his cloak grew even blacker and a living darkness manifested at its hems. Ichigo immediately brought one of his legs a bit further to the back, so he could spring into action even faster, and returned the Quincy King's gaze. Even if I threatened you with killing everyone in Soul Society, or, if I told you I would spare everyone, or, if I brought the one dearest to you back from death, even then you would choose the path of perpetual torment, damning your soul to suffer eternally, a fate only I can bring you. Ichigo knew that it would come. That Yhwach would try and tempt him by mentioning his mother. He knew it, yet he still couldn't hold himself back. In a fluid flash, gliding across the battlefield, he landed right in front of Yhwach with his Zanpakuto descending upon the god, an image of a deicide. Yhwach reached into his cloak and pulled out a magnificent ornate sword in time to parry Ichigo's strike with just one hand. It didn't even budge him. I'll take that as a definitive no, Ichigo. Good. A wild, borderline maniacal grin formed on Yhwach's face as he pushed Ichigo away and reached with his second hand for the teen's exposed throat. Not expecting it, Ichigo reacted instinctively and released a burst of black flames. Without any care, Yhwach ignored them and his fingers closed around Ichigo's neck like an iron claw. Shocked, Ichigo saw the same flames burst out of Yhwach's hand as they licked his neck. Both Ichigo and Yhwach looked at each other. It seems the reports were true. Our powers cancel each other out. Interesting. Also, preposterous. Squeezing the teen's neck, Yhwach brought Ichigo's face closer to him before hurling the helpless teen through air like a wooden doll. The god was strong. Ichigo crashed through several concrete walls, each hit gradually slowing his speed down, until he finally managed to flip himself and land on his feet. He looked up, to see Yhwach several dozen meters away from him, only to vanish and then appear right above him. He pumped Raryoku into his legs and flashed elsewhere, away from constraining battlefield and onto open space. He could feel Yhwach on the back of his neck and so he spun around while exclaiming. Yami no Sukatate. A wall of densely knitted flames formed just an inch in front of him, stopping Yhwach dead in his tracks. His hand, still reaching for Ichigo's neck, hovered in air with the tips of its fingers slightly touching the shield of flames. To the god's great annoyance, he seemed to have been unable to penetrate it. I see. You are not using them as a simple tool, you incorporated them in your own Zanpakuto instead. Sickening, Ichigo. Truly, an abhorrent sight. Yhwach stated and, after cocking his hand back, smashed through the shield with pure, raw power. At that point, though, Ichigo had already backed further away. So, my powers are not completely useless. In that case. Anjutsu no Ka, Ichigo shouted in mid-slash and released a potent torrent of thick flames straight at Yhwach's face. The attack surprisingly hit the mark, though Ichigo somehow knew Yhwach just let it happen. As the fiery energy slowly dissipated from Yhwach, Ichigo heard the Quincy King grunt incoherently. With narrowed eyes, he took a thoughtful step back. Yhwach was bound to do a quick and hasty retaliation, of that Ichigo was quite sure. He wasn't wrong. Once the remnants of his ability died down, Ichigo saw and felt black energy, an energy that had the same texture as his black flames, bursting into existence with Yhwach serving as the epicenter. A blanket of protection, the energy washed over the Quincy King and, for a short while, hid his face from Ichigo's gaze. There was a small detail that did not escape the teen's careful eye. One side of Yhwach's mustache looked fairly burnt. You became more powerful than I have expected, Ichigo. That is truly unfortunate. Yhwach's voice boomed over the battlefield akin to a thunder, bringing a wave of reiatsu on the whole scene. Ichigo clenched his jaw but he managed to remain standing up straight. You think. Above Yhwach, A large bright line of energy formed without a warning and shot down a human-sized reishi arrow. His hand wrapped its fingers around it, an action that caused the arrow to slightly change its shape, making it look like a large broadsword. Yes, it is unfortunate, as now I have no other choice than to subdue you with overwhelming force. I had intended to take you back with me and re-educate you at a more gradual pace, but it seems there will be no time for that. Yuwatch said, his words starting a few seconds of total silence. Ichigo was ready. At the first sign of a change in the air, he plunged to the side as fast as he could and, with gritted teeth, watched Yuwatch's reishi broadsword slash the air in an arc so wide, he could feel the stirred air tickling his cheek. That thing, I can't let myself get his with it. Ichigo thought and immediately channeled enough Raryoku into his somewhat free hand. When he felt his enemy approaching him, he hastily pointed one finger in his general direction. Bakudo number 1, sigh. Ignoring the pain from overloaded Kido, he sprang towards Yuwatch. Well aware that his Kido was the lowest one he could choose, he wasted no time. He didn't expect the spell to actually work properly on an enemy of this caliber, but he didn't care. The only thing he wanted from it was a distraction. As expected, the spell managed to just slightly move Yuwatch's hands, but it bought Ichigo enough time to close the distance and bring his sword down on the Quincy King in a diagonal arch. Putting all of his weight behind the strike, Ichigo felt his Zanpakuto sink a little into something soft. With wide eyes, he quickly realized it was Yuwatch's forearm. His Zanpakuto managed to cut through a web-like pattern on the man's skin, but it went no further than that. Still, it was enough to draw blood. However, he wasn't allowed to celebrate his victory for much longer as Yuwatch's second hand came crashing down on his face and blasted him away. Well, that was unexpected. I did not think you could damage my blood. It seems marking you as a special war power was well deserved. I really should stop underestimating you in any way. Ichigo heard only half of the words, as he intently tried to clear his head. The punch to the face almost cracked his bones and left him with ringing ears and double vision. He tottered and violently shook his head. After a scream rang in his mind, he mindlessly threw himself to the ground and by sheer luck avoided getting decapitated. Slowly getting his vision under control, he instantly brought up his Zanpakuto and managed to parry a powerful blow that rattled the bones in both his forearms. It seemed Yuwatch was a powerhouse even in the strength department. I fought Kenpachi, I fought Unohana-san, I even briefly fought the old man himself. None of them had this amount of ridiculous strength. This is like 3 or 4 copies of Kenpachi hitting me at the same time. He thought and felt his knees shake under the immense pressure. Shifting his Zanpakuto, he let Yuwatch's reishi broadsword slide along the blade and hit the ground next to him. Debris from the ground obscured both his and Yuwatch's vision. Sharp pain in his left thigh prevented him from flashing away and he was forced to try and block another of Yuwatch's strikes. Doing just that, he found himself skidding across the battlefield. He noticed around half a dozen tiny arrows of reishi protruding from his pained leg. The wounds were tiny, but they hurt like hell and the longer the arrows stayed in his body the worse the pain became. He yanked them out with a flick of wrist and released a content sigh. Now this is what it should have been from the beginning. Me pushing and you losing your breath, Ichigo. Shit. He parried another slash, but it seemed like the reishi broadsword's reach didn't correspond with its mass and Ichigo felt a sharp edge cutting into his calf. A ribbon of blood leaked from the wound and turned the lower part of his clothes a bit wet. I can't concentrate enough to keep my own blood active and it seems like my natural defenses are not enough. He mentally whined and bit the inside of his mouth. Yuwatch was closing on him again and Ichigo tightened the grip on his Zanpakuto. Just when he was about to parry the Quincy King's strike, he released a fair amount of his Raryoku. Getsuga Tensho. The brilliant crescent wave of energy pushed against Yuwatch's sword with incredible pressure and, after a brief struggle, it exploded and violently pushed the man away. It's ironic. Despite his obvious strength, he isn't that good in a combat. Yet, despite that, he feels overwhelming. Even when I fought Aizen, I somehow kept a tiny spark of hope that was whispering me, you can win. Against this guy, his presence alone is so suffocating, so unbearable, I don't think I can win like this. I can somewhat fight him, hold my own for the moment, but that's all. It feels so damn hopeless. With a barely audible growl, Ichigo gathered his strength and followed after Yuwatch with the sword on the ready. Even if he felt what he did, he wasn't just going to lie down on the job and let others deal with it. He could sense his enemy had already recovered from his previous strike, and so he quickly changed the trajectory of his shunpo and swung his zanpakuto with all of his strength. Screeching loudly, his blade met Yuwatch's sword in a firework of sparks. However, he felt the minuscule movement of his enemy's blade and slightly raised one eyebrow. In return, Yuwatch did the same, clearly not expecting Ichigo to push him to this extent. In an impressive burst of raw strength, the Quincy King retaliated and hurled Ichigo away with a hefty shove. Ichigo didn't even need the ability to see the future to know what was coming next. Briefly leaving his body sail through the air, he focused all of his concentration on his Raryoku control and let it flow into his own blood. Once he crash-landed and got back on his feet, he spotted a massive reishi arrow closing in on him and knew he had no time to dodge. But he had expected it. With a web-like pattern forming all over his skin, he raised his zanpakuto and, using it as a shield, he took the stand. The arrow hit him unlike anything before. The force behind it was not comparable with any strike he had blocked so far. His feet dug into the dirt and his elbows bent a bit, but still, he managed to hold his own. The ground below and around him caved in and formed a crater of a cracked stone. Still, he withstood it all. Then the arrow lost its structural integrity and blew up. I honestly thought it could end this pointless fight, but Yuwatch spoke only to stop with his mouth opened in surprise when the dust from the explosion cleared up and he saw Ichigo still standing. The Quincy King narrowed his eyes, but there was a hint of a grin hidden beneath his mustache. "Ah, Blut, you already mastered it to this extent. Truly, your latent ability to grow in power, your potential, cannot be matched by any and none." Breathing slowly and deeply, Ichigo let his body and his Raryoku take care of the multitude of lesser injuries covering him from head to toe and stared at Yuwatch with a hard gaze. While he had managed to withstand the powerful attack without any serious wounds, it still shook him up. For the first time since his fight with Ulquiorra, he had felt fear. He got afraid that maybe, just maybe, he would get blown to the smithereens. He got afraid that he couldn't do what he had promised to do. The unreasonable, unconscious and irrational feeling that one can't defy almost paralyzed him from within like a snake writhing in danger. It was terrible, a horrifying experience that helped him understand just what kind of opponent he faced right now. What kind of mind-boggling creature his enemy was. It was only in that last moment of defiance he had realized it. Months ago, he had faced Aizen, who had claimed to be a god. Now, he was facing the real deal. He was facing the god. Alone and isolated, the Soul King listened to the echoes of the void, growing weaker with every passing second. There was only one thing he could think about. Fratricide. An especially strong echo reverberated in his head like a gong. It woke him up from his bodily slumber and made him feel just a tiny fragment of human emotion lesser beings called a worry. The fate of the entire world depended on one person and one person only. On one young man, practically still a teen, with the power to bring the world to destruction, if he ever thought of it. The young man felt panic. The Soul King wanted to help him, to ease his worries and to push him through the ordeal, but he couldn't. Not even he was omnipotent. Not anymore. Therefore, there was only one thing he could do, and he did it immediately. He prayed. Flashing images, thoughts and memories. Bright pictures on a non-existent canvas within the mind that only he possessed. An overwhelming darkness trying to swallow them. A flood of grief and anxiety whirling in a vortex of his emotions that he couldn't control. They paralyzed him, made him weak, forced their unreasonable conditions on his fragile consciousness and turned him from a warrior to a simple teen that was still unable to forget that one rainy night when he couldn't protect the one person he loved the most. It was like standing in a hurricane of bullets, his body bare and unprotected from the pain coming at him from every direction. He couldn't control it. The dark wave washed over him with a monstrous reach, grasping him under his neck like a god of revenge, whispering hateful words into his ear, putting them in his own mouth. He couldn't control it. It was like trying to escape the quicksand, only it wasn't the sand eating him, it was something much, much worse. If he let himself get eaten, he would never be able to return from the darkness. He couldn't control it. Or could he? Images of his loved ones, the ones he cared, glowed in warm light. A memory of his mother's smile, a memory of his sister's smiles. When his life was simple and full of happiness. His first kiss with Yoruichi. The tender but not so gentle touch of a grinning healer. The smile of a small Arankar as she quietly slept on his chest. Yes, Mama loves you too, sweetie. Ichi-ni is the best. I love you, Ichigo. Like a raging fire, the bright light blew away the darkness and turned the canvas blank, yet warm. He was scared. But it was all right. Renewed determination filled his veins like electricity, filling him to the brim with its shocking power. His fingers wrapping around the hilt of his Zanpakuto, Ichigo shook off the dizziness and shot towards Yuwatch with Raryoku blazing around him. Yuwatch flared his spiritual energy as well and the two torrents of black fire met in a thunderous noise not even a second later. Completely ignoring the possibility of getting burned, Ichigo angrily crossed the flames and cut through the smoke in one fell swoop. With his blood reaching a boiling point, he came face to face with Yuwatch and brought his Zanpakuto down on the man. God or no God, he had to fight. His inner spirit always told him to abandon his fears and only to look forward. Even though he currently found himself unable to do the former, he could definitely do the latter. A parry later, the teen saw Yuwatch's free hand forming a fist and flying straight at his face. It was the second time his opponent did it and so now he was prepared. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, Yuwatch. His Raryoku ready, he uttered the word. Bakudo number 8, Seiki. An orb of bluish energy formed in his left opened hand as he moved it against Yuwatch's fist. It burst at the contact but it worked as intended and successfully repelled the attacking hand. Using that minuscule window of opportunity, Ichigo spun around and slashed at his opponent one more time. Blood vene anhaben. At first, Ichigo did not understand what happened. When his sword almost collided with Yuwatch, he thought he had him. But in the last moment, just before his blade could nick the man's clothes and body, he heard a clang and his Zanpakuto stopped moving. Even though he was still trying to push it in, he couldn't move it an inch. Slowly, something translucent came into existence, encapsulating Yuwatch like a shield and blocking his blade from touching the man. Narrowing his eyes, he withdrew his sword to strike again when he realized the translucent thing started to grow. When it came in contact with the skin of his hand, he jerked in pain and hastily backed away. It felt like he tried to suck out the Raryoku from my body. He thought and, looking at Yuwatch, gulped. He noticed a web-like pattern covering the whole translucent barrier. You managed to learn how to use blood, Ichigo, but if I had to guess, it was instinctual. However, I am the father of all Quincy. I can do things with Reishi and Raryoku you wouldn't even dream of. Yuwatch stated and let the barrier gradually dissipate, as if taunting Ichigo to try and come at him again. Ichigo didn't want to disappoint him and did just that. Leaping in the air, right above Yuwatch, he slashed down while expelling tremendous amount of Raryoku. Getsuga Tensho. However, against Ichigo's expectations, Yuwatch did not respond with his translucent barrier. Instead, he let his own black energy burst out of him and used it as a sort of a cushion that slowed and weakened Ichigo's Getsuga to the point where he could repel it with just his Reishi broadsword. I think we both know you can't win this fight, Ichigo. So, a question arises. Why would you continue with this charade? Ichigo heard Yuwatch ask once he landed on his feet. You think this is a game? The teen asked, slightly disgruntled. Oh, no. I certainly do think you are trying hard, but, Ichigo, do you take me for a fool? If you truly wanted to fight me with every intention of killing me, you would have released the final stage of your Zanpakuto a long time ago. Ichigo felt a slight knot tying itself within his stomach. His mouth dried and he licked his lips. What makes you think I won't do it? Bankai is a last resort a Shinigami uses when there is no other way. Yuwatch grinned. So very different from the past when you used to use your Bankai every time you got a serious fight. People don't change that fast, Ichigo. You are offending my intelligence. Believing your words would make you sound arrogant and plain stupid. To challenge me without using your full power. I don't think so. Ichigo reflexively took a step backwards and tried not to look away. The knot in his stomach grew larger. You think I don't see your true objective. You think I can't sense Aizen's Reiatsu, so carefully hidden with numerous seals. No, Ichigo, for some reason, you are trying to deny me access to Aizen's body. It's almost as if you knew what I intended to do with him. As if you and your friends were preparing some sort of a trap for me. A lower eyelid of Ichigo's left eye twitched without his consent, but he didn't respond to Yuacha's words. He didn't believe his own voice wouldn't betray his emotions. In return, Yuacha's grin widened. Ah, so it is like that. I'm afraid your actions were pointless. There is nothing that can stop what's coming, Ichigo. No petty or elaborate trap can prevent the inevitable. Ichigo tightened the grip on his Zanpakuto. Then Yuacha's grin vanished. I enjoyed our spar, but it's enough. It's time for me to move on. Expecting a sudden strike, Ichigo instantly flashed away from his last position only to realize there was no strike coming. Looking back at Yuacha, he saw the Quincy King standing still with a calm expression on his face. What is that? Ichigo thought when he noticed tiny columns of bright light emanating from Yuacha's hand that the man turned towards the sky. Ichigo, I'm sure you have heard about it. About what happened all those years ago, during a certain rainy night. Cold stone glare formed on the teen's face, but Yuacha continued as the columns of light in the palm of his hand grew larger. Oswalin, the holy selection in which I can take the power I had previously distributed to my Quincy. It is time for it again. It is time for my original, true power, to return. Don't blink for a second, Ichigo. Before the light completely consumed Yuacha, Ichigo managed to send another Getsuga at him, but the ability just dissipated at the point of contact without doing anything. The column of light shot up towards the sky, where it split into numerous smaller columns that dashed towards different locations all over Seraiti. Ichigo couldn't see where they went or what happened once they reached their destinations, but he knew it couldn't be something good. Then, after a while, he felt the spiritual energy around Yuacha to grow to unnatural, grotesque proportions. Getting goosebumps, Ichigo swallowed. Then the light died down before he realized it. There, Yuacha stood, looking no different than before. Ichigo, it's been fun. Now, I will not kill you. I want you to witness the end of this world with your own eyes. I want you to witness the birth of the new one and see just how wrong you were in your defiance. When Yuacha slowly raised one arm and pointed his hand towards him, Ichigo narrowed his eyes and raised his Zanpakuto to act fast. Before he realized it though, incredible pain almost tore his mind to pieces. Wah! His vision tilted and he found himself falling on the ground. Shocked to the very core from pain, he could see his own arms and legs, torn to pieces, falling down next to him, no longer attached to his body. Ha! Hyaarg. Farewell, Ichigo, a long shot away from his previous battlefield, where he could no longer hear wailing of his defeated opponent, Yuacha looked at a person firmly held against his will in a containment tube. That person was a former captain of the 5th Division, Aizen Sosuke. He was still alive and conscious, but the many seals covering his whole body prevented him from taking any action. Yuacha slightly shook his head and grimaced. Well, what do you know? They really did quite well in stopping you. He muttered and raised his right hand. In an instant several seals came undone, allowing Aizen to open his mouth. Foolish as he is, Kurosaki Ichigo is the real thing. Even after everything I came through I still cannot best him. The former captain said with a clear distaste in his mouth. A wave of a hand later, another seal vanished. Yes, he is an amusing child. Powerful but still a child. Well, you both are in my eyes. Aizen squinted his eyes at the man and ignored his word. I'm quite surprised that no even the Hogyoku could help me and make me his equal. It is, after all, based after the, well, I don't want to completely destroy the taste in my mouth, so I will not speak him name. Yuacha's hand stopped moving as his gaze gained intensity that made Aizen suddenly wary. Some of the seals were still in place and, while he could get rid of them on his own now, it would still take him some time. Therefore, he was still unable to move properly. When he saw Yuacha's hand reaching for his chest, he stiffened. Your precious little Hogyoku, huh? That tiny little jewel full of miracles. I wonder, is it making you immortal just like that, or is it because you are tapping into his power? I wonder, what would happen if I took it for myself? Would it make killing him easier? Yuacha said very slowly, as if enjoying every single word that caused Aizen's eyes to widen more than before. Then Aizen realized his intentions, but he was powerless from stopping him. When Yuacha's fingers sank into his body, he looked at him one last time. "Father." Yuach snorted and then returned his gaze. "You have served me well, my bastard son. Despite not inheriting the Quincy blood, you still managed to get close in becoming the thing that could deliver me the Soul King. You created the Hogyoku, and for that, I am grateful. You will become the last founding stone in my new world." A blinding light erupted from Aizen's body and a blood-curdling scream crawled from the depths of his being when Yuach forcibly reached into his soul and dragged out from him the energy that served as the Hogyoku. Crushing it in his hand, Yuach reached for its energy and sucked it out into his own body. Quote? Quote. A tiny ribbon of murky energy shot out from his body as if reacting to the Hogyoku, causing the Quincy King a small bit of discomfort. The energy vanished before he could even register it with his own eyes. "I don't know what you did, but it clearly didn't work. I can feel the cursed Hogyoku within me. Thank you, my son, fathered in darkness." At that moment, Aizen's body limply hit the ground, devoid of any energy, or devoid of any light. Giving it one last look, Yuach then turned to the sky and vanished in a brilliant light. The only thing that remained after him was the dead body of Aizen Sosuke. The immortal false god was no more. Chapter 29, Ragnarok. Moments before Ichigo's defeat, during Yuach's Oswallen, the same phenomenon kept repeating itself all over the Seraiti, whenever there was a battle between Shinigami and the Knights of the Quincy, the Sternritters. Be it a battle of honor, a battle of revenge, or a simple battle for survival, each and every single one of them ended when a massive pillar of light struck the unaware Sternritter from above. Some of them died instantly, their life energies violently ripped out of them, their flesh torn from their bodies, leaving nothing but clothed skeletons behind. Some of them survived the initial wave and remained in one piece, but with their minds broken and their souls torn asunder, they soon died too. However, some of them, the stronger ones, the clever ones and the cunning ones, survived with both their bodies and their minds intact. They were the only ones capable of screaming in pain as the one thing they had honed for their whole lives was taken away against their will. Their special abilities, born after receiving a piece of Yuach's soul, disappeared like the wind, leaving them only with their innate power to manipulate Reishi. Despite still being capable of fighting, one by one, they all eventually surrendered. Their god had abandoned them. Their god had betrayed them. And so, they renounced their god and became the one thing they had been fighting against. They became pagans. High above the Seraiti and high above the troubles of him former followers, the father of Quincy, the king of Quincy, the god of Quincy formed a grim smile. With his true power finally reclaimed, he became aware of the happenings beneath him. But he didn't care, not when he was so close to achieving his goal. Now, boy. Do not think you can just waltz here twice in a row without expecting no resistance. A bald Shinigami clad in a white haori and a presence of a monk said with a wide smile. Yuach eyed the leader of the Zero Division with disdain and distaste. But I do expect resistance, Hyasu Bikeep. I just don't really care for it. For I am Yuach, the rightful god of a world once whole, of my kingdom come. He looked at all the other members of the Zero Division and raised his right hand. Clear the way to the Soul King, or I shall paint it with your dead bodies. Ichigo didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been seconds, minutes, or even hours since he got defeated, and he wouldn't have known. Maybe his body just hit the ground. He didn't know, and he didn't care. He didn't care because he couldn't. Whatever Yuach did to him was causing him constant agonizing pain that was impossible to beat with simple willpower. It was so overwhelming and terrifying he slowly felt himself getting crazy. Indescribable and absolute, the pain turned him into an infant, unable to control any and all of his senses. Sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. Each sensory input felt like a shower of molten lava, constantly being poured down his throat and all over his body. Ichigo. His body twitched in response to the sound of a scream, instantly increasing his suffering. The sound of multiple landings and the vibration of footsteps tore into him, making him twitch again, creating a cycle of never-ending agony. Holy fuck, how the hell is he still alive? Somebody dropped on knees next to him. He felt a hand touching his forehead and he bit his lip until it bled. Do something, Hana. For all that is dear to me, just do something. I don't even. Ichigo, can you hear me? On the far end of his mind, at the precipice of insanity, Ichigo absorbed and understood the words and, with the last bit of strength, opened his mouth. Pain, numb the pain, can't focus, can't regenerate. He mumbled and hoped it was loud enough. A gasp cut through the wind. Motherfucker, he's still conscious. Hana. On it, something green appeared in his distorted vision. Focusing all of his pitiful concentration on it, he felt a familiar warm sensation slowly flooding his insides. Little by little, his vision corrected itself and his mind walked away from the edge of dementia. It took quite a few moments and a lot of quiet whispering, but, eventually, his mind came back to life. Thank you, he managed to squeeze out before closing his eyes and focusing every bit of his energy into the thing his hollow part had taught his so many months ago. High-speed regeneration. In his mind, he traveled back to the training where he was forced to cut off his own arm over and over again and, begrudgingly, thanked his hollow part for being a sadist. He was still in a lot of pain that, months ago, would have prevented him from focusing on regenerating. Now, though, he could do it. Nevertheless, the damage done to him by Uwatch was extreme. Coupled with the remnants of his spiritual energy still present in the wounds made the process of regenerating tedious and very slow. But thanks to the efforts of the 4th Division's captain, he was able to complete it without losing too much of his spiritual energy, still needed for an inevitable combat. When he was sure everything was in its place and that he wasn't missing any part of his body, he let out a content sigh and relaxed. Immediately, a dark-skinned person knelt down to him. Within a second, he felt himself getting crushed by a tight hug. It made him smile. I'm okay now, Yoruichi, he said while patting the woman's head. She held him for a moment longer before letting go and giving him a warm smile. I know. Can't get too emotional now, can I? Cracking his neck joints, he slowly got up and received another hug. This one was brief. I don't think I've ever seen a person living through such extensive injuries, Kurosaki-san. Your spiritual energy is truly out of this world, Hana said with an angelic smile, but, also, with a twinkle in her eyes, once she let go of him. In return, Ichigo just shook his head. Then he noticed the blood and gore on the ground and felt his throat getting dry. He swallowed. Seeing his own body parts scattered around like exploded meat felt disturbing. His hands trembled. I didn't think it was that bad. He gulped and turned away, to see everyone looking at him with grim expressions. Only then he realized there were a lot more people there than just Yoruichi and Hana. With them were also Yukitake, Renji, Toshiro, Rukia, Hisagi, Matsumoto and more. Almost 10 people in total. He blinked in surprise. What happened? After giving a pale Rukia a light squeeze, it was Renji who answered him. That's what we would like to know. Seems like the main Quincy force lost their powers and most of them surrendered. Also, where's Uwatch? All of a sudden, his Reiatsu just vanished. Flashing images flipped through his mind and Ichigo recalled the past minutes. He also recalled something that happened even before his fight with Uwatch. Old man Yama Jii. As soon as he asked, they all looked down. All but Yukitake, who returned his gaze with a sad face. Gone. Only parts of his Zanpakuto remain. Kiraku-san. Yukitake perked up a bit at that name. He completely depleted his Raryoku, but he'll be fine. Onmitsukido managed to snatch him away before Uwatch could finish him off. They suffered heavy losses for that, though. Ichigo released a breath he didn't even know he was holding in. That's regrettable but still good to hear. The others. Yukitake glanced at the rest of his colleagues, especially at Renji, who was still waiting for Ichigo's answer, and shook his head. I'm not really sure. We hurried here as soon as we could, but, if I had to guess, Quincy officers lost their powers before something bad could happen. About that. Ichigo chewed on his lower lip and then raised his right hand, only to massage his jaw. While doing that, he started to stroll as well. Looking at the ground, he spoke. Short version, Oswalin. He glanced up, to see Yukitake and the other captains pale a bit. Most of vice captains, however, narrowed their eyes in confusion. What's that? It has something to do with those light pillars, right? In short, Yhwach can grant the Quincy special powers by giving them a piece of his soul, and this Oswalin is a reverse process. He explained briefly and gave them a moment to absorb the information. There was a short silence. Wait, you mean he can use, oh shit. He didn't know who said that, but he quickly shook his head to reject the words. No, at least I don't think so. But he did mention something about reawakening his true power. He glanced at Renji, who returned his stare with a hard gaze. Then he blasted you into pieces. Then he blasted me into pieces. Renji kept looking at him for a few more seconds. Fucking hell, how do you even fight that kind of power? To answer him, Yoruichi moved from Ichigo's side and resolutely shook her head. First, we have to find him, then he's on his way to the Soul King. Ichigo interrupted her, causing everyone to look at him in surprise. But he wasn't finished. Also, you don't. Fighting Yhwach is my job and I have to do it alone. He had expected he would have to extinguish a lot of flames after those words, but the sheer ferocity of some people surprised him. Now listen here, are you out of your mind? He blasted you into freaking smithereens. If you fight him alone. He quickly jumped away from Yoruichi and Unohana when he felt their Reiatsu exploding and quickly raised his hand to stop them. I wasn't fighting him to win, so I didn't even use my full power. Not that I can win with it, but he certainly won't blast me to pieces again. What the hell are you talking about? Why wouldn't you fight to win? Renji exclaimed with a confused glare. Standing on the opposite side of the scene, Yukitake suddenly widened his eyes. The message from the Soul King. Ichigo gave a short nod. He has a plan, he muttered and briefly glanced at the others. Then he took a deep breath and closed his eyes. I can't tell you what it is, though. He expected another outburst, but, to his surprise, none came. Does it really require you to take on Yhwach alone? Yoruichi asked in a stern tone that was unlike her. Ichigo ignored it. He had to. No, I mean, look, Yhwach, he can sort of see future, any future event that revolves around him, at least that's how I understood it. He opened his eyes to see all of them staring at him, blinking. What? Yukitake managed to ask. His true power is some sort of foresight. I don't know how powerful it is, but it's dangerous enough that the Soul King made plans to go around it. Ichigo explained, but as they all still seemed confused, he continued. Because I share with Yhwach the same power of black flames, he cannot see the future in which we both are present. That's why I should be able to deceive him. He felt Yoruichi squeezing his arm. How can you be sure? He placed his hand on hers and formed a small but sad smile. Because I already deceived him. He did exactly what me and the Soul King wanted him to do. He said and glanced towards the location, where he had hidden Aizen. When he saw a figure emerging from there and walking towards him, he nodded to that person. You mean you plan to get blown up? He shook his head. No, I planned for him to absorb Aizen's Hogyoku. Which he certainly did. Only now realizing there was a newcomer, they all, aside from Ichigo, turned towards the captain of the 12th Division, Kuretsuchi Mayuri. Next to him was his vice-captain, dragging a small wagon with Aizen's body in it. He looks dead. Yukitake gulped when he looked at Aizen's body. Kuretsuchi scoffed. That's because he is dead. The temperature of the air immediately dropped several degrees. Ichigo sighed. He knew Aizen would die, and he also knew this information would generate an enormous amount of new questions everybody would want to ask him. However, he couldn't dawdle for any longer. Thanks to Unohana's constant help, his Raryoku was regenerating fast and he needed to move. Zero Division wouldn't be able to hold Yhwach back for too long. Inhaling deeply, he ignored the others and looked straight at Kuretsuchi. Is it ready? For the first time since he met the scientist, Ichigo saw an honest and determined expression on the man's face. Yes, the preservation field should keep his body stable for at least a day. Plenty of time for you to do what you have to do, Kurosaki Ichigo. With a hint of a smile, Ichigo nodded to the man, thankful for his cooperation. Then he noticed Kukaku Shiba flashing towards him. Before he could greet her, though, a feeling of dread washed up over all of them as something seemed to turn any black color around them to a liquid. Rapidly, it flowed to the sky. What was that? Ichigo looked at Kuretsuchi and then at Kukaku. We're out of time. Kukaku, I need you to get me to the Soul Palace right now. One by one, they all fell. It was to be expected. Facing the god, one cannot prevail by simply trying hard enough. No lesser power of a man could triumph over near omnipotence of the Quincy god, the father of Quincy and the king of them all. No seasonal trick, helpful gimmick, illusion or a hoax could withstand the crushing force of nature. Simply said, Yuwatch was too strong. Tenjiro Kirinji, also called the hot spring demon, was fast, but even he couldn't outrun the time. Hiryo Hakafuna, also called the ruler of grain, could create a life, but even she couldn't stand above the true creator. Senjumaru Shutara, also called Great Weave Guard, could manipulate any cloth, yet a god was beyond any manipulations. Ichigo Hyasube, also called the monk who calls the real name and the leader of the Zero Division, was the Shinigami who had named any and all creations and things within the afterlife, but even he couldn't call the god's true name without getting crushed. Not even sacrificing the future of Soul Society was enough. There was only one man still standing. One of the oldest and most eccentric members of the Zero Division, Etsunamiya, also called the God of the Sword, and the man who created the one thing any and every Shinigami used all the time, a Zanpakuto. Even now, you are willing to stand and fight me. Admirable, but foolish. The world will be reborn and there is nothing you can do to prevent it. Namiya, facing Yuwatch with his own creation, didn't even twitch. Wanna bet, flying through the air within the transportation pillar, heading towards the Soul Palace, Ichigo felt nervousness slowly creeping into his mind. He knew what he had to do. He knew he had to do it without looking back. He was no longer afraid. He had abandoned his fears the moment he returned from Aizen's nightmare and, even more so, once he continued to fight Yuwatch. One kiss from the woman he loved before he left for the Soul Palace gave him more than enough confidence to move. He did not fear his own death. If he did everything he had to do and he succeeded in saving everyone and died after that, he would be fine with that. Dying without succeeding, though, that was something he dreaded. He had always wanted to protect those he cared about. Failing as the protector would kill him more than death itself. With a heavy heart, he gulped and glanced at the only company he took with him, Aizen's body that was hanging between complete death and near death. Not that there was any chance of the man coming back to life, as he truly was dead, but his body was still needed. One god down, two more to go. There was a ringing in his ears and no amount of rubbing them could calm it down. His hands felt sweaty and his throat dry. Legs were jelly and his mind tight like a string of a bow just before releasing an arrow. He was ready and yet not. The pillar landed on solid ground and shook ominously. Its small door opened. A gate of hellish heaven awaited him on the other side. With a calming breath, he took a step forward. When he crossed the threshold between the pillar and the Soul Palace, between peace and war, the first thing he saw was desolation. Right after that he noticed chunks of meat and gore scattered across the ground like confetti blown up during celebrations. In a sense, there had been a celebration. A twisted ceremony of a new god. He felt his stomach turning but refused to throw up. He needed to see it, to feel it and to smell it. It was like a small nudge to keep him going and preventing him from stepping backwards. A reminder of what could come if he failed. Kurosaki Ichigo, my name. Hearing a voice, he spun around in surprise. It felt familiar. Call my name. He gulped and looked through the gore. It felt like the voice was coming from everywhere, but also from the pile of meat. Call my name, Kurosaki Ichigo. Steeling his nerves and calming his breath, Ichigo recalled a certain man to whom the voice belonged. Ichigo Hyasube, he stated evenly, unsure of what was going on. Then, in front of his very eyes, the gore, the chopped up flesh, began to stir and move, gravitating towards something that looked like a piece of a head. Faster and faster, the carnage of blood and flesh turned into something concrete and the body of the leader of the Zero Division slowly reconstructed itself, until the man opened his eyes, very much alive. Ichigo suppressed another urge to vomit and fought to forget the sloshing and smacking sound of meat piecing itself together. Then he watched as the man sat down. You have my thanks, Kurosaki Ichigo. We of the Zero Division are bound to the Soul Palace and the Soul King. If those persist, so do we. Also, all of one's power resides in his name, so calling my name let me borrow some of your power so I could regenerate. Ichigo clarified before Ichigo could ask anything, and then the man looked at him with somber gaze. Ichigo, I implore you to put a stop to Yhwach. Ichigo returned his gaze and nodded curtly. We, the Zero Division, have been defeated. My body is restored and others will be as well, but our power is burned out and we cannot wait to replenish it. I know the Soul King has a plan, as we were a part of it, but even then, defeating Yhwach is nigh impossible. Do not underestimate him in any way. Before the wind carried Ichigo's last words through the Soul Palace, Ichigo was already rushing towards the large cylindrical structure, the Soul King's residence. He left Aizen's body behind, perfectly sure the Zero Division would know what to do with it once the time came. Now he was alone but not lonely. With his Zanpakuto at his side, he was ready to face the end of the world. It didn't take long before he appeared in front of his goal. Before he crossed the entrance, he gripped the hilt of his Zanpakuto and quietly muttered, "This is it, Zangetsu." Bankai. Everything around the teen bent a little as the sheer power of his Reiatsu fought against the molecular structures of matter, trying to disintegrate it with its presence alone. Ichigo was strong and he knew it. Still, the words of warning still rang in his ears. The stronger you are, the harder you fall. Keeping that in mind, he entered the Greater Soul King Palace and embraced the eternity. Inside, he was welcomed with a sight of Yhwach standing across the room, facing the Soul King with his hand raised and his flames burning. On the opposite side, the Soul King simply stared at the Quincy King with dead eyes. At the sound of Ichigo's footsteps, they both slightly turned their heads. "You made it, Kurosaki Ichigo. I am most glad." The Soul King greeted him, clearly expecting his arrival. On the other hand, it seemed Yhwach did not. "You should have stayed down, Ichigo." The Quincy King muttered and aimed his raised hand at the teen. This time, Ichigo felt the wave of Raryoku before it hit him. However, unlike the last time, he was ready and the energy passed him, harmless to his body. It did create a strong pressure on his chest, but that was all. "I see. Now you are serious," Yhwach said and slowly lowered his hand, only to immediately point it at the Soul King. Another wave of Raryoku pulsed out of him, but, before it hit the Soul King, the Shinigami deity simply moved his arm and a wall of bright energy rose from the ground and cancelled the oncoming strike with ease. Seeing that, Yhwach squinted his eyes at the Soul King and finally lowered his hand without raising it again. "Seems like we reached an impasse. Each of us is at least as strong as the other. There is no point in continuing this, brother," Soul King said in a soothing voice, as if trying to diffuse the anger that even Ichigo could feel emanating from Yhwach. The teen said nothing, but Yhwach clearly had other plans. "You, as strong as me, do not make me laugh, brother." Yhwach spat the last word with so much hate, it caused his flames to burst out of him in a small explosion. They shot at the Soul King like a lizard's tongue, but a powerful pressure dispersed them in midway. "If you continue to meddle in this, I will no longer think of sparing you, Ichigo," Yhwach exclaimed as Ichigo lowered his sword, previously swinging it in direction of Yhwach's flames. In response, Ichigo shook his head. "It's pointless to threaten me, Yhwach. I'm ready to stop you no matter the cost. Because you are content with the way this world exists." A hollow laugh escaped Ichigo's mouth. "Ha, because it's who I am." Yhwach flared his Raryoku. "A blinded, misguided fool." Ichigo raised his sword, a protector. The two of them clashed and the air within the building rose. In a desperate attempt to escape from the crushing pressure, it folded on itself and ripped into the walls, cracking them with pure, unconstrained energy. Like a gale, the wind howled and danced around all of them, screaming incomprehensibly. Both Ichigo and Yhwach ignored the noise and stared at each other with rage and determination. Pushing against each other, their blades ground in an explosion of sparks, but neither was able to get the upper hand. Grinding their teeth, they separated at the same time. And then clashed again. A collision of titans. It was almost a miracle the walls withstood the second wave of pressure. It no longer mattered from what material they had been made. The two beings fighting within their bounds were not something one could measure. A god versus a boy who gained power of a god. An ancestor versus his descendant. When they jumped towards each other for the third time, the Soul King intervened and, waving his hands, pushed them through the door and out of the building. His voice resonated after them. "Ichigo, I am counting on you. Despite the situation, Ichigo couldn't help but to laugh till tears formed in his eyes. A literal god hopes I can defeat another god. That is so absurd. I hoped you of all people could see what I am trying to accomplish, Ichigo. Do you not wish to see a world without fear? Do you not wish to see a world where death no longer existed? Where you could be with your loved ones forever? Yhwach exclaimed, crushing Ichigo's inner thoughts with a powerful swipe of a sword. Ichigo quickly brought his Zanpakuto up and prevented the blade from reaching him. I wish to see you gone, Yhwach. That is all, he retorted and, pushing Raryoku into his Zanpakuto, attempted to blast Yhwach away. However, he only managed to push him back a few feet. In response to Ichigo's words, Yhwach briefly changed his expression from anger to pity. I see. Then you are giving me no other choice, Ichigo, he said, and the black flames surrounding Yhwach grew larger until they completely obscured the teen's vision. Every Sternritter in my army possesses a letter, designating a unique power that awoke due to them drinking my blood. Every letter in alphabet, aside from the first one, as that is my own letter. Do you know what this letter means, Ichigo? An asshole, Ichigo thought, but said nothing out loud. As in the Almighty. I control the entirety of my own fate. I can influence every future of my destiny, and I can change the very course of the time. Yhwach said, and, without warning, a shadow rose from the ground beneath Ichigo's feet and pierced right thought the teen's thighs. Just like this, Ichigo, an excruciating pain attacking his senses, felt a sense of dread creeping into his mind. He had been prepared for anything. The message from Soul King, besides outlining a certain plan, explained many things about Yhwach to him. However, there was no mention of Yhwach possessing such terrifying power. Either Soul King thought it couldn't mess up the plan, or he didn't know about it. Biting his lower lip, Ichigo ignored the pain and swung his sword upward and released a wave of energy straight at Yhwach. Getsuga Tensho. The black flames immediately swallowed the attack, allowing not even a speck of energy to reach Yhwach, and the man shook his head. Pointless struggle, Ichigo. Another shadow shot from the ground and pierced Ichigo's side. The teen grimaced. His reaction speed was extraordinary, but the shadows possessed none or close to none energy, and they also seemed to come from his blind spot, making it practically impossible to dodge. I thought, you couldn't see the future with me, he muttered through gritted teeth. In response, Yhwach shook his head again. That no longer matters. With my Almighty fully awakened, I can control my fate. Actually seeing what happens in the future is of little importance. Just knowing I'm fighting you is enough for me to prepare future traps. Ichigo felt his head spinning. He didn't understand. He was unable to comprehend the sheer nonsense of Yhwach's abilities. What he did understand, though, was that he was quickly getting out of his league. Meta abilities were something that did not sit well with his own reservoir of skills. The more he tried to think about it and the longer he remained stationary, the faster he would get beaten. Resolutely, he jump-started his high-speed regeneration and began to flash across the battlefield using every single bit of his speed. Each time he fleetingly touched the ground, he released an attack. Getsuga Tensho, Hado, Bakudo, his black flames. He used everything in his repertoire just to keep his strike pattern unreadable and random. To attack as fast as possible, he kept his Kido spells simple, without incantations. Even if they were lower ranks, having Transcendental Raryoku gave him hope they could still amount to something. Hado number 4, Byakurai, he flashed above Yhwach. Getsuga Tensho, landing behind Yhwach, he pointed his index finger at the man. Bakudo number 1, Sai, flashing around his opponent, he swung his blade in a diagonal arch to bring his flames at Yhwach from the side. Anjutsu no Ka. However, his efforts were all fruitless and futile. Each and every single attack was crushed with simple movements or with wall of thick flames, dense enough to pose as miasma. Moreover, while using the final strike, a shadow tendril drilled a deep wound into his shoulder, briefly incapacitating his ability to move his sword. He tripped. He fell. A truly valiant effort, Ichigo. I commend you for your determination and bravery. Any other man would have been long done for, dead or curled into a ball, crying and whimpering in fear. Yet you still persist. You try and don't back down. Were you fighting on my side, I would title you a hero of the war. Yhwach stated as Ichigo slowly got back on his feet. Then his expression changed into a grim one. But you are still just a man. An ant to be squashed under the boot of a god. It is time for my kingdom to come. In a split second, Ichigo found himself defending from countless strikes from each possible direction and from random moments in time. A blade fell down on him but he parried it. A wave of black flames rose behind him but he dispersed it with a powerful swing of his Zanpakuto and a blast of his own flames. With a squelch, a shadow tendril dug deep into his back and he saw the tip coming out from his abdomen. Seeing Yhwach moving at him, he gritted his teeth even more and yanked himself out. He flashed away. Just keep moving. Blinding light. Another wave of intense pain. A bright arrow in his calf. Without thinking he broke it with a simple swing of his hand and flashed once more. Anjutsu no Ka. Black flames burst out of him and cancelled Yhwach's own flames. Bakudo number 8. Seiki. An orb of light blue energy repelled Yhwach's hand as the man tried to reach for Ichigo's neck. Retaliating, the teen spun around and released an explosive amount of Raryoku, finally forcing Yhwach to pull out even if for a moment. But it was in that moment Ichigo realized it. It finally dawned upon him, the thought piercing him like a holy Quincy arrow full of light and understanding. He quickly flashed to the doors leading to the Greater Soul King Palace. I can't beat him. He saw Yhwach closing on him yet again but, instead of trying to defend, he snorted. In the next moment, the blade of Yhwach's sword cut right through his stomach and went out through his back, forcing him to spit blood right at Yhwach's face. Good job, Ichigo. It's time for you to leave the scene and it's time for me to advance further. Yhwach said with a wide grin, seemingly enjoying Ichigo's blood splattered across his face. Slowly, without a care in the world, Ichigo raised his free hand and placed it on Yhwach's hands, still gripping the hilt of the sword. The teen smiled. No, Yhwach, it's time for you to die. Just as Yhwach's expression turned confused, Ichigo gripped the hilt of his Zanpakuto and gathered his remaining strength. Hijiriru no Kusari. In a burst of blinding light, chains made of pure energy materialized around Yhwach and embraced him in a mighty hug. With a morbid satisfaction, Ichigo saw fear creeping into Yhwach's eyes when the man was unable to get rid of them. What is this? Blood trickling down his chin, Ichigo's smile widened. He could almost see the smile of a certain woman forming above them. This is a gift from my mother, the one you damned to death. It is thanks to her and thanks to the light I inherited from her that you will be purified. Now. Ichigo's yell was accompanied with the door behind him getting blasted open and a tendril of light shooting from the building and straight through the teen until it embedded itself deep into Yhwach's torso. The man's expression quickly turned into animalistic rage. Is this your doing, Soul King, brother? A weary and sickly-looking figure slowly walked out of the building with the tendril of light beginning in his own torso. Even though the person shouldn't have possessed any emotions, there was still something akin to a weak smile on his face. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Soul King left his confinement. It was with the purpose of killing his brother. Yes, it is my doing, brother. But, I couldn't have done it without the colossal effort of Ichigo Kurosaki. The Soul King stated and turned his face towards Ichigo, nodding to him in gratitude. Ichigo felt too weak to return the favor. The blade within him seemed to have been siphoning all of his remaining strength. You think this will stop me? You think this is enough to kill me? Yhwach yelled and tried to dissolve the chains with his black flames but to no avail. The Soul King just watched him struggle. It is of no use, brother. You took the bait and the first time you came here, you allowed me to transfer a part of my soul into you, probably thinking you did that by yourself. Yhwach stopped struggling and looked at him in shock. The Soul King spoke again. You took the bait again and, after Kurosaki Ichigo's good performance, you absorbed the Hogyoku from within Aizen Sosuke. Speechless, Yhwach could only shake in rage. Now, you took the third and final bait after thinking you defeated Kurosaki Ichigo for the last time, allowing me to weave the three of us together in a single thread of fate. Because of the part of my soul in you, because of the Hogyoku within you resonating with my powers and, because of the catalyst of Kurosaki Ichigo's own powers, you will be burned from within. Once he said that, the Soul King's body turned brighter and translucent, allowing them to see the void within him. At the same time, the light traveled across the tendril and illuminated both Ichigo and Yhwach with its blinding glow. Ichigo could feel the power vibrating within him, but he felt no discomfort. He was content to receive his mother's hug. However, Yawatch began to trash around as his flames dispersed and the light burned him from within, turning his body into a pure energy. Ya-arg! Curse you, Soul King! Curse you, Kurosaki Ichigo! I will return. When you feel safe, when you think it is over, I will return and I will kill. An explosion of enormous size swallowed all of them and the oblivion came. Ichigo was still smiling. He managed to do what he always wanted to do. Protect. Chapter 30. Epilogue. You really want to do it, huh? Nothing will convince you otherwise. Supporting himself against railing, Ichigo took a deep breath of fresh air and shook his head. You should think about it too, Keigo. The teen in question, one of Ichigo's best friends and a bit of a goof, stared at Ichigo's backside in horror, his mouth forming a big O. Are you out of your mind? Me in university. Just thinking about studying again makes me want to puke. Ichigo chuckled and slowly turned his head towards his friend. There was a playful twinkle in his eyes. I heard the campus is full of single and beautiful young women. He watched Keigo blink a few times. The horror in the goofy teen's eyes turned to greed and thirst so fast, it was almost uncanny. Ichigo couldn't help but to laugh out loud. From beside Ichigo, another of his friends shook his head. He's right, Asano-san. Maybe you could finally find somebody desperate enough to take your virginity. Keigo flinched as if physically hurt and theatrically collapsed on the ground, bawling his eyes out. Ah, Mizuhiro, you are so cruel with your jokes. Ichigo, still laughing a little, glanced at his other friend and coughed to get rid of the mirth. So, you're going, Mizuhiro. The smaller black-haired boy took a sip of juice he held in his hand and nodded towards still crying Keigo. I'll go wherever he's going. Can't let him without a guard. Besides, there's no way he can get a woman without my help. Almost immediately, Keigo stopped whining and jumped towards Mizuhiro's legs and started to worship the boy. Scrunching his face in disgust, Mizuhiro gave Ichigo an exasperated look. Ichigo shrugged. Hey, I thought you knew what you were getting yourself into. The three of them erupted in laughter and Ichigo turned to the view of Karakura town. Standing on the top of Karakura's high school, he could see as far as the outskirts of Naruki town. It was times like these when he could relax and forget about everything that had happened almost 2 years ago. When the fate of the world hanged on a thread, when he had to fight a god and when he won the war. A few quick, nearly silent footsteps resonated on the railing and he felt his head getting pushed into a dark but also warm and soft bosom. What is this about young and beautiful women I hear? Are you no longer satisfied with my services, Ichigo? Ah, the goddess! Keigo exclaimed and fell on his knees, bawling his eyes out once again. Ichigo inhaled the sweet aroma of the woman and sighed. You really enjoy tormenting him, don't you? Looking up, he saw a brilliant smile staring back at him. Yoruichi leaned down and gave him a quick peck on the lips, widening her smile even more. His reactions are always top-notch. He couldn't argue with that. Keigo, even without trying, was always funny enough to make almost anyone smile. Ichigo suspected there was a long and successful career of a comedian in store for the boy. Maybe then he could finally find a woman for himself. So, what's up? Yoruichi's smile withered a bit and, with a scoff, she rolled her eyes. When Ichigo saw that, he rolled his eyes as well. The hospital, yep. Ichigo groaned and shook his head a little. Then he turned to his friends. I have to go, guys. See you tomorrow. As he and Yoruichi were leaving, Ichigo heard Keigo's cry. Remember, Ichigo, no lewd stuff until you're married. There was no way Ichigo would have listened to Keigo and, while walking to the Karakura's hospital, he and Yoruichi took a short detour to do some of those forbidden acts. The teen just couldn't help himself. Yoruichi was just too damn beautiful. Not even long months spent together could satiate his thirst for her. Even a lifetime was too short for that. Even though he was still young, he already knew the two of them were going to spend the rest of their lives together. The thing Keigo mentioned, marriage, was something Ichigo had on more than one occasion considered but, for now, rejected. He was convinced that sealing the deal would make Yoruichi incredibly happy, but they had all the time in the world now. They could marry anytime they wanted and, right now, Ichigo wanted to focus on completing his education. The building of Karakura's hospital appeared in his vision sooner than he had hoped. Steeling his nerves and shielding his mind with a layer of patience, he walked inside, Yoruichi trailing right after him. I thought Orihime would still be here," he muttered when they passed the smiling receptionist. From his side, Yoruichi nudged him with her elbow. "I think she's still assisting Ishida. The older one." Yoruichi winked at him. "The younger one." Ichigo raised one eyebrow and took a short glance at Yoruichi's innocent expression. "Assisting as in, medical assisting." The brown-skinned goddess wiggled her eyebrows. "Oh, I'm sure it can be called that. Tisk, come on." Yoruichi chuckled. "Spoilsport. Fine, yeah, it's medical assisting. She finally managed to get better at some sort of specialized healing." Ichigo smiled warmly. Good for her. After being ripped from her soul, Orihime's special powers of event rejection never truly returned. However, once Yawatch had been defeated, she had woken up from her coma and little by little, month by month, fragments of her soul healed. Thanks to Hachi, the wizard, her 6 spirits had been reformed and she frantically trained to the point where some of her spiritual energy returned and she became capable of some healing once again. Though it was different from her previous powers and even she wasn't sure about its limitations, it was still enough to bring some life back into her eyes. Here, at the hospital, she was learning to further enhance her new technique she called Mantra Palm. Similar thing happened to Chad, though he wasn't as keen on obtaining something that could rival his previous powers. Now that he no longer needed to fight supernatural battles, he was content with being able to see spirits and with the power of his normal, human fists. There was also a rumor of him going for a boxing career right after finishing high school. Walking up the stairs, Ichigo glanced in Yoruichi's direction. "So, what's the deal now? They want to visit Haweko Mundo for some samples of hollow reishi but they refuse to do it without you leading them." Yoruichi answered with a salty grimace, prompting Ichigo to groan. Again, they already met Harabel and the others. I thought they trusted them. Peef, Ichigo, please. Quincy and Hollows have been enemies for 1,000 years. I don't think mere 2 years are enough. When he saw Yoruichi puffing her cheeks, he raised one eyebrow and, with a tiny smirk, deflated one of them with a poke of his finger. She ignored him and puffed the cheek again. Is that what's bugging you? For a few moments, Yoruichi refused to answer and they took the stairs in silence. Once they got close to a certain hospital room, she resigned and lowered her head. I bet they would go by themselves and it's just that Bimbo insisting on your company. Ichigo froze in mid-step and slowly turned to Yoruichi, who was openly pouting. The teen couldn't help and started to laugh. Immediately, Yoruichi's expression turned scandalized and she put her hands on her hips, giving him a hard stare. What's so funny? Ichigo, still chuckling, didn't reply. Instead, he grabbed the goddess of flash and enveloped her in a tight embrace, kissing her on the lips. Only once he let go of her he spoke. I never thought I'd see you jealous again. As Yoruichi returned to pouting, he placed his hands on her shoulders and stared straight at her, until she turned her head to return the gaze. Yoruichi, I love you. Her expression mellowed a bit, but she still didn't seem convinced. You also love Lillinet and Retsu. What's stopping you from falling in love with yet another woman? Ichigo rolled his eyes. Lillinet is special. We share bits of our souls. Retsu. I don't love Retsu. I like her, yes, but we have strict rules between us. We only share a few sessions once a month. Besides, you regularly hump Sui Feng and you don't see me talking you out of it. Yoruichi continued to pout but there was a definite hint of a smile playing on her lips. Before long, she conceded and broke into a grin. That's because you'd like to join us. He laughed and raised his hands in defense. Guilty as charged. Shaking her head, Yoruichi joined him in laughing. Before walking through the door in front of them, she suggestively swayed her hips and gave him a wink. Maybe next time I'll invite you, she said and entered the room. Trailing after her, Ichigo chuckled. Sure, when I'll be in a mood to lose my balls, I'll accept. Together, they entered a special room built only for the purposes and needs of Quincy, the Sternritter survivors of the war. After Yawatch had torn their special powers from them via Oswalin, those who had been still alive surrendered and, after many weeks of negotiating and peaceful talks, had decided to settle in Karakura town. Once they had done that, Rukin had offered all of them a work in the hospital where they could have used their Quincy powers for helping people. They all accepted, under one condition. Ichigo would have to regularly visit them. Ichigo-sama, you're here and, you also brought Shihoin-san. Welcome. Only now Ichigo understood what Yoruichi meant earlier and, looking at the upbeat Quincy in front of him, he chuckled. With a hand raised, he greeted the Quincy girl. Hey there Bambietta, everything all right? When the girl heard him saying her name, she renewed her smile and rapidly nodded. Yes, we're fine. Come on now, we told you to not speak for all of us. Another Quincy, leaning to the wall in the corner, said with a sigh. In response, Bambietta quickly glanced in his direction and raised one eyebrow. Am I wrong, Nak Lavar? The Quincy in question, Askin Nak Lavar, blew on the single strand of hair that was hanging down his face and shrugged. So undignified. Now Bambi-chan. I thought you said to play nice. A different Quincy girl, one with long black hair and a porcelain white skin, said while looking at everyone with a glint in her eyes that Ichigo had been, so far, still unable to decode. Bambietta just pursed her lips, causing Ichigo to nod to the other girl. Giselle, Ichigo-sama, where is Lyle, as Nod and Kang do? Before anyone could answer, the door to the room opened and 3 figures walked inside. We're here. Rukin-san was just giving us last-moment advice. A tall, brown-skinned Quincy said while nodding to Ichigo. The teen returned the favor and then looked over all of them. So, what are your expectations of this trip? Last time I heard, you were close to some sort of a breakthrough. The Quincy exchanged quick glances, making Ichigo roll his eyes. He disliked their theatrics. Yes, we think we can finally make the first prototype of the serum. We just need to conduct a few more tests. That is why we need more samples. The one to answer him was the Quincy Ichigo rarely heard talking, as not. Ichigo stared at him in surprise. You mean it works? Completely. They all shook their heads. No, unfortunately we have a long way to go. However, this first prototype should ensure that no Quincy would go into anaphylactic shock when exposed to hollow contamination. Not even the weakest ones. Ichigo stared at them for a full minute before glancing at Yoruichi. I guess Ishida-san was right. Thanks to their experience, they can finally do what he has been trying to do for years. Next day, a quiet but still considerably unpleasant snoring interrupted Ichigo far too early in the morning. Sleepily blinking, he stared at the ceiling of his room until a small person that lay on his chest shifted. He heard another snore, interrupted with occasional incoherent mumbling, and he glanced down. With a smile, he raised his hand and poked the girl in her cheek, causing her to mumble and wrinkle her forehead. Still, she continued to snore, and so he repeatedly poked her until she groggily opened her eyes and gave him a tired glare. Stop it. She shook her head and strands of her green hair fell down her face and tickled his skin. You were snoring, Ichigo said with a smile. Forming a sheepish grin, the girl rubbed her head in his chest and patted his bare stomach. What can I say, your heartbeat is very comforting. After visiting Hueco Mundo the previous day, Ichigo returned back home with Lillinette, who had been visiting the Hollow World as well but for different reasons. Ever since she had started living with Ichigo in Karakura town, she regularly took some of her time to sleep over in Hueco Mundo with Haribel and the others. At her core, she was still partly a hollow, and short stays in Hueco Mundo helped her feel better about herself. Ichigo originally didn't want to immediately return home. Being sly, Yoruichi had remembered her earlier promise and had offered him a chance to join her and Sui Feng in Soul Society for a night full of pleasures of flesh. However, Ichigo was still wary of the captain of the second squad and had believed it to be just a ruse. In any event, he had needed only one puppy look from Lillinette to completely abandon even the tiniest thought of actually joining them. A small peck on the lips interrupted his trail of thoughts, and he studied Lillinette's sleepy expression as well as the lack of light outside. He gently patted her head and closed his eyes. In that case, I think we can sleep for a little while longer. He felt another peck, this time on his collarbone, and he suppressed the urge to shiver. Sleeping together and an occasional peck on the lips was the most intimacy he and Lillinette shared, but for the past few weeks, the girl had been showing signs of further interests. Thought so. Lilith said, and, before long, they both fell asleep, Ichigo's hands wrapped around her small frame. They both woke up on loud knocking on the door. Ichi-ni, wake up. It's almost noon. Ichigo heard somebody open the door, but then that somebody squealed and hurriedly scurried away. Lilith rubbed her eyes and gave him an incredulous stare. I thought you said they are used to this. Ichigo chuckled. Karen is. Yuzu. Not so much. After lunch, and after ignoring Yuzu's red cheeks and her accusing glare, Ichigo aimed his steps towards Urahara's shop. He had promised Kukaku he would make some free time and join her for a show of fireworks she had been preparing for the last few weeks. Thanks to the new Captain Commander, he had been allowed to create a Senkaimon gate straight from Urahara's shop to Shiba's compound. Ah, Kurosaki-san, welcome. Ichigo waved his hand in greetings and nodded to the exceptional scientist. Is everything ready? Urahara shook his head. Yes and no. Captain Commander wanted you to come to him first, but I assured him I can relay any kind of message to you so you wouldn't have to go. Ichigo tensed. Is it about? Urahara quickly shook his head and placed a hand on Ichigo's shoulder. No, Aizen is completely stable and, after extensive testing, he will be for a long time. I told you that already, Kurosaki-san. In response, Ichigo lowered his head and sighed heavily. I know. Intently staring at his face, Urahara squeezed the teen's shoulder and then retracted his hand. Don't feel guilty, Kurosaki-san. I know I will repeat myself, but Aizen's dream always was to change the way the world was. Now, after his death, a part of his dream is fulfilled and he now stands as the sole king. It was the best possible decision you could have made. Don't beat yourself over it, Kurosaki-san. Ichigo blew a bit of air through his nostrils and looked up to see Urahara giving him an encouraging smile. Then he nodded. All right. Urahara's smile widened. That's better. Now, is everything okay with you? Is the seal intact? I know that yesterday you went to Hueco Mundo in your spiritual body, so I'm kind of worried whether the transition damaged it like the last time. Ichigo focused in his spiritual energy and, after a moment, negatively shook his head. No. I think this new version is finally holding up as you intended. He said and gave the scientist thumbs up, prompting Urahara to take a theatrical bow. Why thank you, Kurosaki-san. Ichigo smiled. No, thank you, Urahara-san. It's thanks to you I can finally live like a normal person. My, Kurosaki-san, are you trying to make me blush? Chuckling, Ichigo nodded towards the entrance to the shop. So, what was the message from Kyoraku-san? As they walked inside, Urahara reached for his hat and shifted its position. It's good news, actually. He finally managed to convince the majority of Central 46, and so now, unless they deliberately attempt to disturb the balance, all the Quincy are free. In case they are forced to use their powers to protect themselves or innocent souls from a hollow, they won't be prosecuted, although they are required to immediately alert the Soul Society, so that proper arrangements can be made. Kuretsuchi-san mentioned he is ready for such a situation. Ichigo formed a wide smile. He was no longer smiling when he stood in the middle of Shiba's family house with his hand close to the doors that led to Kukaku's room, and he heard suspicious noise coming from within it. Noise that completely caught him unprepared and caused him to go red in face. He immediately turned around and decided that maybe he could wait a few hours before coming back, only for the wooden panel under his foot creaking so loud, it almost made him jump. Before he could move from the spot, the noises vanished and sound of rapid footsteps caused him to gulp. Who's there? Oh. Kukaku swiftly opened the doors with a glare, only to lose her temper as soon as she saw Ichigo frozen in spot. Who is it? When Ichigo heard the second voice, he wished he was somewhere else, preferably 1,000 miles below the ground or in hell. Yep, hell would be nice. Another pair of footsteps later, the owner of the second voice stared at Ichigo in shock, only to quickly become mortified. Ichigo immediately decided to cut the silence. It was pointless to dwell on the little things. Hey Tatsuki, I guess you, found your new sparring partner. The girl in question instantly turned the deepest shade of red he had ever seen and seemed ready to explode like a bloated tomato. Before she could, Kukaku intervened. Well, you left her for dry, what was she supposed to do? She stated while folding her arms. Biting his lip, Ichigo fought the urge to laugh. She doesn't look that dry to me. He deadpanned, noting the glistening sweat all over Tatsuki's as well as Kukaku's skin. This time, even Kukaku turned red. However, it quickly disappeared when she noticed Ichigo's barely hidden grin. The two of them shared a laugh. Tatsuki didn't join, but the red color receded from her face and she managed to form a nervous and embarrassed smile. If I didn't know better, I'd say Yoruichi's influence has been rubbing off on you, Kukaku said while slapping him on the shoulder. That's not the only thing. Okay, too much information, Kukaku exclaimed and slapped him again. Then she nodded towards herself and Tatsuki. Wait here, Ichigo. I think we should change our appearances to something more presentable. As she was closing the door, Ichigo couldn't help it but to quip after her. Take your time, I'll be waiting for you too, come. Late at night, good mood quietly slipped away from Ichigo's grasp. The sky was clear with its black color, occasionally brightened with light from distant stars, and the moon shyly illuminated the path of Ichigo's choosing. He was in the middle of the Seraiti, on top of the Sokyoku hill, alone and deep in thoughts. Yoruichi wasn't near. Lilinette stayed in Karakura town and the next session with Unohana was weeks away, which meant he had no companion to sleep with. The lack of intimacy didn't bother him. He was nowhere near as horny as he used to be. However, when night came and cloaked the world in its darkness, every time he was alone his worst nightmare returned and attacked him fiercely, violently, until he woke up trashing and covered in cold sweat. The effects of Aizen's Bankai and all the fighting and killing he had done in 2 wars had been long-lasting and affected him more than he cared and more than he dared to admit to anyone but his father. Thanks to the man's extensive knowledge of medicine, Ichigo quickly understood what was happening to him. He was reminded of it each time he was plunged into deep dark of the night when there was no other being next to him. Yet he didn't want to admit it to others. He could imagine their reactions, their pity, their compassion. He didn't want that. A part of his mind knew he deserved it. For all that was worth, he had killed many beings. That they weren't innocent didn't change the fact that he mowed them down like their lives meant nothing. For everyone he loved, he fought gods and survived. Such encounters had changed him profusely. He liked to think it was for the better. He liked to lie to himself. It was one of the few things many people berated him for. However, he was also maturing and wanted to deal with his problems on his own terms and with his own wits. He knew it probably wasn't the healthiest approach, but he was too stubborn to do it differently. Moreover, he was confident he could do it. He had defeated a literal god. He had defeated his inner demon. There was nothing he couldn't do. As he reached the edge of the Sokyoku hill, the cliff offered him a beautiful and wide view of the entirety of Seraiti. A place that just 2 years ago had been in absolute ruins. They managed to rebuild so much, he thought. Seraiti was still long away from being completely rejuvenated, but the progress so far had been astounding. For a place in Afterlife that used to be proud of its stagnant life, the dynamics of renewing process had been as lively as his 2 little sisters. Barracks of each division had been the first thing to reconstruct, and it had been completed in just 2 months. It could have been done even faster, but Urahara and Kuretsuchi had urged the new captain commander to reconsider including some new upgrades within the reconstruction process. The man's approval had been instantaneous. Soul Society had been years behind some of the technology and advancements of the real world, and it was time to take the remedy pill. It had been costly, but, with some pressure on the noble clans that had more financial resources that they could spend, it had also been doable. With that, life had quietly and slowly returned to Seraiti and to the Gote 13. Friendships had been forged anew, interdivision cooperation had been established stronger than ever, and everyday normality had settled itself as a seed deep within the organization. Moreover, many reforms had been created for the sole purpose of increasing the likelihood that no war would ever come again. Even love managed to bloom within the military organization. Ichigo had been quite surprised to see so many pairs coming out with their relationships. Some of them had been obvious for a long time, but some not so much. Ichigo was happy for all of them. Peace was peaceful, and that was how it should have been. Life is good, but it was exactly in that moment that Ichigo felt a bad premonition. Maybe it was because he took the tranquility of the situation for granted, but, for some reason, he just knew something would come along and damage it. Before his very eyes, a hell butterfly emerged from the vast darkness of the night and quickly landed on his hand. A moment later, Ichigo heard the familiar voice of the new captain commander of the Gote 13, Kyoraku. Ichigo, I despise doing this, but it seems we need your help once again. I just got a memo from Ikibe-san. Out of nothing, Yuacha's black flames appeared in the greater palace of Soul King and encompassed the crystal with Aizen Sosuke. Ikibe-san said you'd know what is going on. If you do, please hurry. I'm trying to avoid a full-blown panic, but captains are getting anxious fast. I already alerted Shiba-san, so she's preparing the transportation as we speak. I truly am sorry, Ichigo. We thought we were prepared for anything, yet once again we find ourselves at your mercy. If this is truly Yuacha, we are powerless and can do one thing and one thing only. Hope for your intervention. The message came to an end and the hell butterfly vanished, but the words still echoed in Ichigo's mind as a reminder that Yuacha's last warning hadn't been just empty words. The madman, the false prophet and a fake god in one person, Yuacha had threatened to return in the future, but Ichigo had thought it to be just the last scream of a dying man. He turned around and flashed across the Seraiti, back to Shiba's mansion. The Zero Division had pulled back from the Soul Palace and there was only empty path from where he stood all the way to the crystal. Ichigo took a step forward. He was furious. He was nuclear. 2 years of peace. 2 years of no war, no battles and no blood spilling. Just smiles and love. It had taken him every ounce of his vast power to bring it back from the brink of destruction. He would do anything to stop Yuacha from taking it all away. He had done it once, he would do it again. Whispers of fear and doubt no longer bothered him. He was a changed man. The glass from broken determination had been cleared and melted, redone and built anew. There was no weakness lurking in the shadows of his inner self. His inner demon, his inner light, they were both complete as the mentor within his sword. There was only one way for him. Going forward and not looking back. The way of a protector. The way of a boy turned god. A god with human heart. A heart which held only one desire. To protect. Standing at the edges of the walkway, he glanced at the goal of his path and leapt across the abyss without hesitation. Through the light and through the dark, through the sealed doors he landed in front of the large crystal that held the corpse of Aizen Sosuke, now embraced in black flames that burned anyone but him. Reaching into his own soul, Ichigo drew out his sword and grabbed the part of him that resonated with the eternal aura of the true Soul King. A parting gift he had received 2 years ago. Ichigo closed his eyes and let it pass through him. He felt pain but also serenity. The duality of the emotions forced him to drop his Zanpakuto and he almost fell to his knees. He could see the glow surrounding him and, for a brief moment, he saw everything. He saw past. He saw future. He was stretched across the void, existing in every time and at every place. In that moment, he became omnipotent, closer to a true god than any other person before him. It scared him more than death itself. Fighting against the vast infinity, he raised his hands and reached through the black flames in front of him. Foraging through the cloud of Yuacha's power, he placed both his hands on the crystal and willed his will onto it. Intense pain assaulted all of his senses and he felt Yuacha's consciousness at the tip of his fingers, fighting against the overwhelming power he momentarily possessed. And then, without any warning, the cloud of black flames imploded on itself and vanished from existence. Ichigo's hand slipped away from the crystal and he fell on all four, breathing heavily. He could still hear Yuacha's thoughts as they slowly disappeared from his mind and he formed a determined smile. Anytime and every time, Yuacha. No matter the future, I will always be there to defeat you. He slowly rose from the ground and stared at the crystal in front of him. I will protect them all. Forever. Way of the Protector, end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe as well as checking out the author on fanfiction.net.